Okay, we can be seated. Mr. County, come on back up. You are still under oath. Mr. Moran.
Thank you. Mr. Cowing, behind you, I have up People's Exhibit 340. You discussed a little bit the leather couch. May I have permission to approach?
You may.
I know this gets a little confusing because 340 is how the living room appeared on March 29th, 2012, right? Is that actually March, November, 29th, 2012? And it looks different in August of 2013 when you were there. But the point, and what was discussed a bit on direct, is that it was this couch, the one that's against the north wall, that was moved. You got in there by August 2015, right?
Yes.
And it moved this wall here where the television was, right?
Correct.
And you were either present to observe or Ms. Corcoran told you that the dog alerted to a blue line from the couch to the west wall.
Correct.
So then the other locations in the room where there was blood that was positive in the lab, dog didn't alert in those locations, right?
Correct.
It would be okay to take that down if you please, counsel, or leave it, either's fine. By March of 2013, you were making no secret of the fact that Mr. Redwine was a suspect, the suspect. Is that fair?
Yes.
And in March of 2013, you were telling him you would have him prosecuted, right?
Yes.
Not relevant, and it's beyond scope.
Mr. Moran.
Your Honor, the relevance here is just to inform why a citizen might have been reluctant to converse with this law enforcement official who's been telling him that he'll be prosecuted and that he was a suspect. It goes to.
I agree. I think you're good.
In the same vein, and I'm not suggesting this was you or law enforcement, but you did become aware that Mr. Redwine was getting death threats, right?
Yes.
And he, at one point, you in fact called one individual to tell him to knock it off.
Correct.
And that was somebody who was posting online about his fantasies of killing Mr. Redwine.
Correct.
There was discussion on direct about that. Pardon me if I've messed up the date, but I believe it was June 27th, and that was the day that you personally broke the news to Mr. Redwine that his child's remains had been positively identified. All right?
Yes.
And you described that he had an emotional reaction.
Yes.
I believe the word that you chose was that he was weeping.
Yes.
Is sobbing too strong for what you observed?
No.
So suffice to say, strong emotional reaction for the father of this child when you broke the news to him about his son being definitively deceased.
Yes.
When Mr. Redwine was called, and he said that he was in Indianapolis, and you were telling him that items had been found. There was some discussion on direct examination about his response to you suggesting that items had been found, right?
Yes,
And he referred to them both as items, and then he named particular items. Is that right? Shoes, clothing.
he referred to them as articles, and yes, clothing and a shoe.
Thank you for that correction. I recall now as articles. Around the time searching is going on again in June of 2013, there was a vigil, pardon me, held. Is that right?
Correct.
And then after that vigil, you became aware of people gathering at the Billy Goat Saloon. They were planning to do harm to Mr. Redwine.
Objection, and any more questions after this? It goes beyond the scope.
Any more questions after this on that issue? I think it goes beyond the scope, and this will be the second, maybe the third time, but at least the second time you've established this. And so after this, I want you to be done with it. Okay?
So you were aware that a crowd had gathered and was threatening harm to Mr. Redwine.
Yes,
On February 5th, 2014, you participated in the seizure of Mr. Redwine's pickup truck, right?
correct.
You called Mr. Redwine about it, and he agreed to bring it to you. Is that right?
Yes,
And I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an aside. I wanted to clear something up we talked about before lunch. You mentioned the 41-1, where Mr. Redwine needed to come into, or you were allowed then to take pictures of him, his body, his hands, right?
correct.
And you called him to inform him of that 41-1. He agreed to come and meet with you.
He did.
So you didn't have to chase him down and do anything like that, right?
Yes,
And the same on this February 14th date, when you called him, he was in Farmington. Is that right?
February 14th.
I'm sorry, February of 2014, February 5th, 2014, when you seized the Dodge.
Correct.
And you knew that he was in Farmington because Investigator Gabbard and Investigator Patterson had set up surveillance on the pickup truck, right?
Correct.
And, the Plata County Sheriff's Office personnel were assisted by New Mexico law enforcement agents from San Juan County Sheriff's Office in watching that truck as it was being brought to you.
Objection of relevance and beyond the scope.
Mr. Moran?
Seizure of this truck was discussed by the prosecution and direct, and I just want to establish Mr. Redwine's cooperation because his unwillingness to participate in the efforts to find his son has been raised over and over by the prosecution. There's evidence to rebut that.
Well, I don't understand why people who are watching the truck has anything to do with that. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
On that occasion, when Mr. Redwine provided you the Dodge pickup truck, he did express some frustration because he said he needed to use the truck to get to Texarkana for work.
Objection of relevance.
That one I can see some relevance to.
Is that right?
Yes,
And you were aware that he had driven that truck from Texarkana, Arkansas, before you seized it, right?
yes,
Was it at that time that the GPS unit had been installed on that truck?
In reference to which date?
February 2014. February 2014.
And repeat that question again.
Let me ask it this way. Did you install a GPS tracking monitor on Mr. Redwine's truck?
I don't recall doing that, no.
You were aware that it had been done?
I don't recall.
On June 22nd, 2013, that's when you were on Middle Mountain participating in a search, right?
Yes,
And you discussed that search on direct examination, agreed?
yes.
And on that day, you there was a bone that you found, is that right?
As a group, we found items, yes.
There's one specifically I'm talking about where the two cadaver dogs that you were with indicated the smell of
Objection, Your
human
Honor.
decomposition.
No,
Relevance,
This search was inquired after on
come here.
direct examination.
Go ahead, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I think I'll leave it there.
All right.
Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
So, Investigator Cowan, you were asked about if a report from a different investigator, Mr. Patterson, refreshed your memory about phone service. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
With regard to that, do you actually yourself from the investigation have knowledge about where Verizon works and where it doesn't?
Yes.
Okay. So two things were referenced, I believe. In the recording, it was specific to Middle Mountain, not the house. Am I accurate?
Yes.
And then also, counsel asked you about the house.
Correct.
Can you tell what your experience is in terms of Verizon service at the house?
My experience as a whole, Verizon works better in that area at that time, and especially at that house.
Is it fair to say that all phone coverage is spotty in Vallecito when we get up in the Middle Mountain area, things like that?
Yes.
Have you witnessed one of your fellow investigators be able to use her Verizon phone at the residence?
Yes.
And then when we're talking about Middle Mountain Road itself, in that recording, were you saying that Verizon works better or AT&T from where you placed the call?
Verizon.
Thank you. I'm going to approach the 507, Your Honor. This is just a map of a search area that I forgot to introduce. It did come up and cross the area itself. That's acceptable to the court.
That's fine.
Basically just laying this as a foundation investigator, but you testified about the search on August 6th and where Karen Corcoran's dog went on that search.
Yes,
Is 507 fair and accurate to that?
it is.
And I move to admit 507 in evidence, Your Honor.
I might just word on it briefly. My impression from your testimony was that Ms. Corcoran was just pointed at the trailhead. Is that, did I misunderstand that?
We had her start from the parking area, and she worked. Well, yes, she worked down towards the slope.
Basically, what I'm getting at is you weren't with them for the entirety of her dog sniffing search of this recovery area, were you?
No, not the whole time.
Or did you have eyes on the dog sufficient that you can say that this is a fair and accurate representation of where the dog went, or is this just sort of roughly as you understood it through things people were telling you?
I had eyes on initially seeing them go in that direction, and that's about it.
I'm not certain how far it extends or whether this purple blob in the middle is a fair and accurate representation of what was searched.
Correct.
Judge, on that basis, we'll object.
Any response at all?
Just that judge is being offered for the general area and it's not being proposed as precise. The jury has 520 for GPS coordinates as well.
You know, I'm gonna deny the.
I want to talk to you about the iPhone. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Okay. And counsel asked you if, in your life experience, if phones can be broken and then set out to dry. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Did the defendant say he had set his phone out to dry and it was fixed when you talked to him on June 21st?
No.
What did he actually say about it?
He volunteered a statement that the phone is working again.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the first time you talked to him. So let me give you the exact date. June 21st of 2013, when you reached him and he said that he hadn't called you back because the phone had fallen in the sink. Remember that?
Yes.
Did he say if he'd done anything after the phone fell in the sink?
He said he replaced the phone.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about the entry video. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
You did have something to do a camera video that day, right?
Yes.
What was the purpose of the entry video?
To show upon entry that the condition of the house prior to working the dogs in the house and the condition of the house as we left it. Basically showing that everything is left in its place.
Was that in part based on the defendant's request that you can go in as long as you read everything, how you found it?
Yes,
And then in terms of video, whether it was Officer Corcoran or not on video, did you follow her and Molly around the house everywhere they went during the search?
no,
So you had testified, I think, that you were on the threshold area of the door, right?
yes,
Did you have any opportunity to follow her with a camera without interfering?
No.
And then I'd like to ask you about the comment, defense counsel said, did you make a specific statement about blood and brains on boots? Do you recall that?
yes,
And I believe what counsel asked you was, you said something to the effect of, you've stepped in lots of blood and brain. You recall that?
yes,
Do you know what statement he's referring to?
I do.
When was that statement made?
That was made on June 29th, 2013.
Is that the entire sentence that you said, or just part of the sentence that you said?
Just part.
Do you recall the exact words and sentence that you said on that occasion? And if not, of course, I could refresh your memory.
It would be good to refresh my memory.
Judge, may I approach with page 74 out of 77 related to that transcript referenced by defendant?
Yes. Did you give me enough information, Mr. Beck? I don't say that wrong. Okay.
I'll draw your attention to the sentence that you were asked about, and then I'll draw your attention to the rest of that sentence in the following. So the questions by counsel were related to whether you could have tracked any odor in the house, right?
Yes,
What was the full sentence that you said?
I had discussed with Mark how I have worked other crime scenes. And have come in contact with human biological fluids.
Okay. The sentence itself, do you remember what you said, or do you need the transcript?
Probably needed.
Okay. May I approach one more time, Your Honor?
Yes.
So
This
just
one
so,
is asked and answered.
just so that
Hold on. No, it hasn't been answered.
Not the way he wants, but it's been answered. This is impeachment now.
I think it's appropriate. Go ahead and you can approach.
so as you refresh your memory, what I'm asking you is specifically, what was the entire sentence in the next sentence, so the jury has the context of the comment about whether you stepped in lots of blood and brain, okay?
Okay.
So keep that in mind as you refresh. Please tell the jury what you said.
Yes. I stated we've worked a lot of crime scenes and I've thrown away a lot of boots.
And in that same sentence that you said, you've thrown away a lot of boots and stepped in lots of blood and brain.
Correct.
Objection, asked and answered, improper impeachment.
You know what? It's in. Let's move on.
What do you actually do with boots when you step in things on a crime scene?
I throw them away, and if they're not too bad, I turn them into autopsy shoes.
Do you go walking around crime scenes in the boots that you've walked in other crime scenes in?
No.
And this statement was actually started about the fact that you throw those boots away.
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions, Judge.
Anything from the jury? Counsel, want to come up? Yeah, thank you. Okay, Lieutenant Cowling, Where were you when you placed the call to Mr. Redwine to ask when he planned to return?
I was 6 miles up on Middle Belt Road at the gravel pit.
Okay. Any follow-up from your side on that?
Just one question, Judge. Was that close to the remain site?
Yes,
But you had to go up to the gravel pit though, huh?
that's where we typically base out of.
Right, because there's a cell signal there, right? In part.
Yes,
And when you're down at the remain site and in the ravine and in that area, cell service is not as good. Fair?
it works for Verizon, yes.
But not for both companies and not as you move about in that area. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Okay, can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
You're free to go. Next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the people call Dr. Robert Kurtzman to the stand.
All right. Come on up to the witness stand up here, please, sir. And please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, I do. Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you.
Thank you. May I inquire, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm good, and yourself?
Doing well, thanks. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the record?
My name is Dr. Robert A. Kurtzman. That's Kurtzman.
Dr. Kurtzman, how are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed as the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Montana as a forensic pathologist.
What do those duties include as the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Montana?
So for the state of Montana, we work with 56 different county coroners. We have 2 regional medical examiners' offices, one in Billings and one in Missoula. Our system is set up so that the medical examiner's office is also incorporated within the forensic science division, which includes the latent prints, DNA, serology, toolmark, firearms, chemistry, and toxicology sections, as well as the medical examiner section. We have a total of 4 forensic pathologists, including myself, and one of our pathologists is also a PhD anthropologist. My job is to supervise the medical examiner portion of the forensic science division.
And as part of that, do you also supervise the other forensic pathologists within the office?
Yes, I do. And so in that capacity, what happens is we have a daily conference to review all of our cases that come into the office that are referred from the coroners throughout the state. And we handle about 750 cases each year. And then there may be cases where coroners will call on us for consultation, but not require a post-mortem examination.
When you say 750 cases, are you referring to 750 autopsies?
Correct. So mostly autopsies. Some of those cases are external examinations, and some of them may be a partial autopsy.
I'm going to be asking the court to have you qualified as an expert in forensic pathology. In order to do that, I need to go through your educational and career background, okay?
Certainly.
You tell the jury about your educational experience.
Sure. I received my undergraduate degree in biology from Quinnipiac. Well, it was Quinnipiac College at the time. It's now Quinnipiac University. I attended Quinnipiac between 1973 and 1977. Then I went on to the College of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery in Des Moines, Iowa. I graduated with a Doctor of Osteopathy degree in 1980. After I completed my medical school training, I then served a 1-year rotating internship at Cranston General Hospital, which is located in Cranston, Rhode Island. A rotating internship is an internship for a year spent rotating through various areas of specialization in in medicine. So that would include family practice, pediatrics, surgery, ear, nose, and throat. Basically, it's a broad exposure to different areas in medicine.
Doctor, I'm sorry, can you explain to the jury what osteopathic medicine is?
Sure. So osteopathic medicine is one of two main streams of traditional medicine that's practiced in the United States, where the practitioners have a full scope of practice. Most people are familiar with MDs. That would be considered allopathic medicine. Osteopathic medicine had its beginnings or origins in the 1860s, and there's an emphasis on musculoskeletal aspects in osteopathic medicine. And in some ways, at least in our education, we're encouraged to have a more holistic approach to the treatment of medical issues that a patient might present with.
Thank you. So if you could continue walking us through your educational and career experience.
Sure. So after my internship, I spent a year and 4 months in general practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The reason for that was my stepfather had passed away. He had a practice in that area from 1950 to 1980 when he passed away from a brain tumor. I was just going back to keep the office open until my mother was able to sell the office. At the conclusion of keeping the office going, I then started a pathology residency, and that is a study of disease and how it affects the body. So that's what pathology is. And pathology in general includes various aspects of what's considered anatomical pathology. And so it's studying the diseases and disorders that you might see with all different parts of the body. So that's skin, bone, heart, lungs, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, intestines. You look at all different aspects of the body and you become familiar with the diseases that affect those different portions of the body. And of course, trauma would be considered a disease aspect as well.
Did you then have an opportunity to work in neuropathology?
So as a part of my pathology training, there were certain areas where I received some additional training. Neuropathology in particular was spent at the Henry Ford Hospital in Michigan, and in Detroit, Michigan. And I spent about 4 months working with a neuropathologist there by the name of Jacob Chasen. And also during my pathology residency, I received some special training in dermatopathology at the University of Michigan, virology at Children's Hospital in Detroit. I spent some forensic pathology rotations and toxicology rotations at the Office of the Medical Examiner's Office in Detroit. And I also I took a specialized course in orthopedic pathology or bone pathology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Bethesda, Maryland. And that was a course specifically designed to look at all aspects of bone pathology, bone growth, physiology, embryology, infectious diseases, trauma, neoplastic disorders. So there's a kind of a broad representation of bone pathology, if you will.
Dr. Kurtzman, if I can interrupt, sorry. You mentioned your work is in forensic pathology at the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office. What was significant about that experience?
So that experience, I spent during my residency in pathology, you're exposed to subspecialty areas. So that was my first exposure to forensic pathology. And I spent 2 months rotating at the medical examiner's office in Detroit. At that time, it was a office that employed 6 full-time staff pathologists and then 2 fellows. And the office handled about 3,500 to 4,000 cases per year, including about 800 to 900 homicides per year. And so that was my first exposure to the medical examiner's office. Later on, after I finished my pathology residency, I went back there for a year of dedicated specialty training or forensic training, or excuse me, fellowship training in forensic pathology at the medical examiner's office, and that was between 1987 and 1988.
Thank you, Doctor. Can you tell us about your current licensing and board certifications, please, or any that were recently retired?
Sure. I'm currently licensed to practice in Montana and in Colorado. My initial license was in Pennsylvania, and a second license I had was in Michigan. However, I've recently retired those licenses because I don't plan on heading back that way.
And what positions have you held here in the state of Colorado during the course of your career, Dr. Chris?
So I came to Colorado in 1992 from the Detroit area. And at that time I was residing in Mesa County, and I was performing postmortem examinations for the Mesa County coroner. And then that later expanded to include other counties in Colorado. So in northwestern Colorado, that included Moffett, Rio Blanco, Garfield, Eagle, Pitkin, and Mesa County. On rare occasions, I would do cases that were sent up from Delta and or Montrose. And then I also did autopsies on a pretty regular basis in southwestern Colorado from 2012, 2013 up until about 2015. And that included La Plata County, Archuleta, San Juan, Dolores, and let's see, basically 5 counties in southwestern. And then on occasion, I would go over to Boulder and Adams County as well.
Also serve as a forensic pathologist there, or serve in that capacity?
To serve in that capacity. So coroners in the state of Colorado would request postmortem examinations, and those examinations have to be performed by a pathologist, a forensic pathologist.
You've obviously had a long career, but if you could just briefly discuss your work experience outside the great state of Colorado, some of the positions you've held in other states.
In Michigan, before I came to Colorado, in addition to working with the Office of Medical Examiner in Wayne County, I worked with Oakland County, Tuscola, Sanilac, Monroe, Macomb. I also did postmortem examinations for the Wayne State University Bioengineering Department. They had a program where cadavers were subjected to various types of trauma in a very controlled and documented setting. And so my purpose was to perform the postmortem examination, document whatever injuries were present, and then that information was utilized by the bioengineering staff. And so they were the principal investigators in those cases. And then here in Colorado, just the counties which I've already discussed. And then in Montana, mostly the same thing, although we work with the entire state, so that's 56 different counties.
Can you please tell the jury about some of the faculty appointments you've held during the course of your career?
So when I was a fellow at the medical examiner's office in Detroit, typically we were on staff in the office, and we received students from Wayne State University. And so it wasn't a formal position per se, but it was a clinical instructor position. And so I've done the same thing for, it's been years ago now, Michigan State University, the osteopathic school there, osteopathic school in Pomona, and at Mesa State University, well, not Mesa State, Colorado Mesa University now. I was a volunteer instructor, probably between, I guess, about 2013 and maybe 2015. I don't recall exactly the dates there, but I was doing some examinations at the Forensic Investigation Research Station there. And so we would have students that would come through, and they would observe autopsies. And then the only recent clinical instructor position that I have is just recently, within the last couple of months, is with the University of North Dakota School of Medicine.
What professional memberships do you hold, Doctor?
I'm a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the Montana Medical Association, the American Society for Clinical Pathology, and the College of American Pathologists.
And any offices or positions you've held over the years relevant to this case?
Not specifically. I've served in different capacities. In hospital settings, I've served as chief of staff, board member, for different locations. The American Osteopathic College of Pathology, which actually I forgot to mention, I'm a member of that. I had a board position and a leadership position there. And I'd say that's about it.
Have you had the opportunity, Dr. Kurtzman, to work on child fatality teams or disaster recovery teams?
Yes, I have on a number of occasions. With regard to mass disaster in 1987, in August, there was a DC-9 that crashed on takeoff at the Detroit airport, and there were 156 fatalities that were experienced at that time. And at the medical examiner's office, we established a temporary morgue location at the airport, and we processed the remains of the deceased to provide identity for those who perished in that crash. And then in terms of child fatality review teams, that's something that I was a member of in Colorado, and I'm a member of in the state of Montana as well. And in child fatality review teams, basically we're looking at any type of fatality that's associated with the individual under the age of 18.
How about presentations you've given during the course of your career? If you could just touch on a few of those for the court, please.
Sure. Many presentations. Many of the presentations that I've done were at the American Osteopathic Association. Some of them have been provided to law enforcement. Some of them have been provided to local forensic groups or death investigation groups. At the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, I provide education at the basic and advanced coroner training in Montana. I've presented education to a variety of law-related groups, so prosecuting and defense attorneys or combinations thereof. And I can't think of anything else that's more specific at the moment.
How about publications?
Publication, I've just got a couple of publications. One from years ago, which related to a death that occurred in the mountains associated with a lightning strike, and a more recent publication just a few years ago dealing with high altitude death investigation. And so that touched on high altitude illness, so high altitude pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, and also some of the factors that one might see in terms of a differential diagnosis that include injury or hypothermia, lightning strikes, things of that sort.
In the course of your career, have you been previously qualified as an expert in forensic pathology?
Yes, I have, many times.
On approximately how many occasions, Dr. Kurtzman?
It's been hundreds, although I've never really kept track.
And at least some of those have been here in the state of Colorado as well?
Yes, mostly in Mesa County, Garfield, Eagle, Pitkin, that area.
Your Honor, at this time, the people have moved to have Dr. Kurtzman qualified as an expert in forensic pathology.
Mr. Bogan?
No objection.
He'll be qualified as an expert in forensic pathology.
Dr. Kurtzman, what does a forensic pathologist do on a day-to-day basis?
So, forensic pathologist is a pathologist that specializes in forensic pathology. So it's a subspecialty of pathology. Pathology is the study of disease and how it affects the body. And with forensic pathology, that information is used to determine the cause of death and the manner of death in individuals who died suddenly, unexpectedly, or in a violent setting. And one of the key aspects of forensic pathology is the interpretation of patterns and distribution of injuries that are sustained to various parts of the body. The reason being is that the pattern and distribution of the injury is indicative of the mechanism by which the injury has been sustained. So, as an example, if a person sustains a gunshot wound, you need to be able to determine, is it a gunshot wound entrance or is it an exit? If it is a gunshot wound that has evidence of a close range of fire, so you look at those characteristics. If an individual sustains injuries in a motor vehicle collision, is there a pattern that suggests that that individual might be the driver of the motor vehicle or perhaps another occupant? And so we look very closely at injury patterns, and again, we look at the disease process, and when we are called upon to examine cases, it's to determine the cause of death, which is what brings about the individual's demise, and then the manner of death. The manner is how that cause is brought about. So an example of a cause of death might be a heart attack. If a person has a heart attack and dies and there's no other extenuating circumstances, generally that would be considered a natural disease process. If a person is engaged in some type of activity that ordinarily would not be expected to result in that person's demise, so let's say you're walking down the street and you trip and fall off of the curb, hit your head and sustain a blunt force head injury, that could be fatal. That would be considered an accident. If somebody does something to themselves knowingly to take their own life, that would be considered a suicide. If somebody does something to someone else with a, how should I say, a specific purpose, that would be considered a homicide. Homicide shouldn't be construed with murder. Murder is a process that is determined through the adjudication process. So when I say homicide, it just means that somebody has done something that has caused another person's death, and it's done with some deliberateness.
Generally speaking, how does a forensic pathologist become involved in a case that might become a criminal prosecution?
So there's two ways generally in the United States. Medical examiners or forensic pathologists oftentimes work in medical examiner offices, and in that case, we work with investigators. And the investigators are notified by either law enforcement or by dispatch that there's a death, and the investigator will respond to the scene and collect information. If it's determined that a postmortem examination is necessary, then that case would be brought into the office. In the case of a coroner system, what happens is that the coroner acts essentially as the investigator. And so the same thing happens, it's just that the coroner is the one that collects the information. In coroner states or in coroner jurisdictions, the coroner has the statutory authority as it relates to the death, but they have to have a pathologist perform that examination if it requires an autopsy. And not all cases require an autopsy.
And I was struck by something you just said. You said collecting the information or gathering the information. So is there information you look at to determine cause and manner of death besides conducting the autopsy or the review of the remains?
Sure, absolutely. Whenever we look at a case, it's important to collect information that may be available, but it's also important to try to treat that information as just a piece of information that's been provided by someone else. And what I mean by that is that when we actually do our autopsy or postmortem examination, what we're doing is we're either going to corroborate or we may not corroborate what has been reported. And so if a piece of information is provided with regard to the person's health status, that becomes important. If the piece of information is provided about activities that they might have been engaged in prior to their death, that becomes important. And we try to look at all that information, and then you look at the case, and then through your evaluation, determine if it's consistent or not, and then you would render an opinion based on the findings in your examination.
So fair to say you look at all that information in determining what cause and manner of death is your expert.
That's correct.
Turning to this case, Doctor, were you first contacted about this case in September of 2013?
I was.
And did you, along with Dr. Dawn Mulhern and the coroner, Jan Smith, take a look at some postcranial remains that had been recovered?
So that came a little bit later. I can provide my recollection
While you're here, sure.
So the first contact that I had was from the coroner, Jan Smith, who I had worked with for a number of years. And she had indicated to me that the remains of individual, possibly Dylan Redwine, had been recovered, and that those remains were taken into custody by the Plata County Sheriff's Office. And they were identified as human remains by Dr. Don Mulhern. I didn't see any of the remains. I wasn't involved in the case at that point in time. My understanding was that Jan did not have custody of those remains. Typically, what would have happened if she had custody of those remains is she would have called me and said, "Hey, I've got a case for you."
Can I stop you for 1 second?
Sure.
Just so the jury's aware, Dr. Mulhern, to your knowledge, is a forensic anthropologist.
Dr. Mulhern, I know she's an anthropologist, and I don't believe that forensic anthropologist would be inappropriate. I don't know of her board certification in forensic anthropology.
But you were aware that she was assisting the La Plata County Sheriff's Office in identifying human remains versus animal.
Correct, and that is certainly appropriate. Anthropologists are well versed in osteology, and they can provide valuable, needed assistance in death investigations.
I believe I interrupted you. You were about to share with the jury your reaction when you first spoke with Jan Smith, and I'd like you to share with them.
So I just expressed that I was disappointed that she did not have custody of the case and make it a case per se. I'd learned that the bones, in a desire, obviously well-intentioned to obtain the identity, were sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and a portion of some of the bones, the femur, was crushed to obtain DNA. And that my understanding is that it was prior to any official documentation of that portion of the bone. And so if there potentially is evidence in that portion of the bone, it would have been lost.
So that was your understanding at the time, and the jury's already heard about photographs and examinations that were conducted. And then in September of 2013, did you have an opportunity to look at the remains, the postcranial remains of Dylan Redwine?
I did. That was, I believe, the first time that I saw the remains, and I think that was up at the college. And Dr. Mulhern was there, and I believe that Tom Kelling was there also. And so that was the first time that I had looked at the bones.
And was Jan Smith there as well?
Yeah, actually, I think she was, although I don't recall that with certainty.
And the bones you looked at included the left femur, right clavicle, right tibia, and toes from the left and right foot.
Correct, and scapula too, right scapula.
And the right scapula.
Yep, so shoulder blade on the right, collarbone or clavicle on the right, right and left thigh bones, right lower leg bone, and a couple of little small bones from the toes.
From the left and right foot.
Correct.
And based on the bones that were examined at that point, and that was September of 2013, were you able to make a determination as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death at that time, Dr. Christie?
No. The bones had evidence of postmortem predation. I did not recognize any specific pattern of injury on the bones that would be indicative of a injury that might have been sustained during life.
And I'm going to fast forward then, if we could, to November of 2017. Did you then become involved in this case again?
I did. So by that time, I had relocated to Montana in November of 2015. And I was notified by the office that there was a desire for a forensic pathologist to look at the case. And so at that point in time, I asked if I was going to be involved in the case, that I wanted to see the information just as it might have been received had Jan called me from day one. And when I say Jan, the coroner, Jan Smith, back when the bones were originally found. So I had a chance to take a look at the bones and the cranium that had been discovered. And I looked at the bones at the Forensic Investigation Research Station in Grand Junction.
And to be clear, you've been asked to render an expert opinion as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death.
That is correct.
And you were going to look at the cranium and the bones, I believe you said.
That is correct.
What other information did you review as part of your analysis in order to determine cause and manner of death?
So there was a historical timeline which had been presented by Lieutenant Jim Mizell with the La Plata County Sheriff's Office. And there was a map which showed the location of Mark Redwine's home, the location of the remains when they were first discovered, and then the additional remains, or the cranium basically, discovered about a year, about 2 years after the original remains were first discovered. Let's see. Actually, if I can refer to my records.
I was going to ask, if it would refresh your recollection, I'll ask the court to grant you permission to look at them. You just need to let us know what you're looking at.
Go ahead, Mo.
Thank you.
This is a letter that I had authored, which is dated March 3rd, 2018, which is to Jim Mizell. And I have a listing of the items that were reviewed.
And Doctor, can I stop you for a second? Will the court allow him to read from the list, or would you prefer he refresh his recollection? And go line by line.
Do you care?
I'm going to ask him some questions about these sources, so I'd rather have it all out there as accurately as possible.
All right, so reading's fine.
And can I just look at, I know I got the document. I just want to look at it and make sure I got the right copy.
That's fine. Come on up.
No objection to reading sources review.
Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead, Doctor. Thank you.
Forensic anthropology report and photographs prepared by Dr. France, forensic anthropologist. That was dated December 15th, 2015. A map depicting Middle Mountain Road with locations and distance deemed pertinent to the death investigation. The La Plata County, Colorado Grand Jury indictment. The probable cause affidavit in the matter of extradition of Mark A. Redwine. Timeline of electronic devices, which is listed as S12 19697. Work product, Dylan Redwine, also dated same number, authored by Jim Mizell and Lieutenant Tanya Goldbrick. Schematic drawings of the first floor Redwine home. Schematic drawings of the second floor Redwine home. Photographs depicting locations of luminol and phenolphthalein positive testing for blood. Photographs of a white Dodge pickup truck. A composite chart including skeletal diagram, scene photographs, and personal effect photographs. And then email communication from me dated October the 11th. From you, meaning Jim Mizell, with the subject line Redwine.
What was your reaction, Dr. Kurtzman, to seeing that Dr. Diane France, had been consulted as a forensic anthropologist and rendered an opinion on this case, as well as having produced a report that you reviewed?
I thought that was good. Dr. France is a well-known forensic anthropologist. She's a board-certified forensic pathologist. She's practiced many years. I've worked with Diane a number of occasions over the years.
Respectfully, I think at this point, the answer starts to become cumulative and bolstering. He's already answered this was a good thing. It's evident he respects her opinion. I think anything beyond that, like I said, bolstering and cumulative.
You care? You want any more of this?
No, Your Honor, I could round it up with one more question.
All right, go ahead.
Were you pleased to see that that kind of review had been conducted in this case as you set out to do your job?
Yes.
Thank you. Based on your review of the materials you described, as well as the examination of the bones and cranium, which we're about to get into, what did you determine to be the cause and manner of death in Redwine?
So with regard to the cause of death, I can't honestly say I would know the cause of death. All the organs are gone, the skin is gone, all the soft tissue is absent. And so there's no way that I could say what the exact cause of death is. However, with regard to the circumstances leading up to the report of a missing 13-year-old, and my interpretation of the findings that I saw from my direct examination, the conclusion that I had was that the manner of death was homicide.
Doctor, I'd like to have you take us through the steps of your analysis leading to your conclusion, your expert opinion, that Dylan Redwine, the manner of his death was homicide.
Sure. The information that was provided to me did not provide any indication that Dylan Redwine, as a 13-year-old, as a teenager, there was no indication that he had any significant pre-existing natural disease that would have caused his death. It was reported to me that he was in good health.
And is that something, Dr. Kurtzman, you do in all cases when you're conducting an analysis to determine cause and manner of death? You look at pre-existing health conditions as part of that analysis?
Yes, it is.
And what did you learn about significance, or what did you learn of significance about the Redwine home in your analysis?
What I read from the reports was that there was blood detected in portions of the Redwine home.
And what was the significance of that to you? Why that matter?
So I would basically take that at face value. That would be something that is derived by the investigation of individuals who have expertise in crime scene analysis, and it would be reported that they have found blood. And typically, blood means that a person has sustained some sort of an injury or some sort of a pathologic process that has caused bleeding. And so if you have blood from an individual that is deposited on a surface, more often than not, it'll be associated with some form of trauma.
Did you learn that one of those surfaces was a floor that was actually covered by a rug?
Leading, and to a certain extent, and I know experts can rely on hearsay in informing their opinions, but at a certain point, the hearsay starts to eclipse the analysis and the opinion.
Well, on the hearsay, I disagree. It's clear under Rule 703 that it's admissible in order for the jury to understand and weigh the opinion that this expert is giving. In terms of the leading, I think it's okay at some point. I'll make you stop, I guess. So if you keep objecting, that's fine. But I understand you're trying to get into something specific.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Do you need me to repeat the question, or do you recall the question?
Just for accuracy, let's repeat it, please.
Okay. Did you learn that on at least one of the surfaces where blood was detected, it was a floor covered by a rug?
Yes, I did.
And what was the significance of that to you as you looked to determine cause and manner of death for Dylan Redwine?
That there was blood that was concealed.
And what about the map of Middle Mountain Road that you described just a few moments ago? And I should also ask, have you also had an opportunity to visit Middle Mountain Road yourself?
Yes, so I actually had an opportunity to visit the area yesterday when I arrived here in town. And I went up with the investigator. We saw the home of Mark Redwine. And then we drove from the home up Middle Mountain Road to the site of the bones that were recovered initially. And after we arrived at that site, we walked down the slope to see more closely where those bones were recovered. And it had been reported to me, so I had a general understanding of the terrain and the vegetation that was present, but this actually gave me a chance to see it firsthand for myself. Then we departed from that location and we drove to a ridge overlooking where the cranium was discovered.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to respectfully ask to approach and object to further narrative about what happened yesterday. I have a discussion I want to have with the district attorney and Your Honor at the bench.
Thank you. Dr. Kurtzman, at the time you authored your report, in this case, you'd also looked at the map, the Middle Mountain, am I right?
Yes, I had.
And at the time you authored your report, what was the significance, if any, of looking at the map and the locations depicted on the map?
Just for orientation, a clear depiction of the circumstances that are reported, gaining an understanding of the location as a mountainous region, the location of the decedent's home, where Dylan was reportedly last known alive, where the bones were recovered, and then ultimately where the cranium was discovered.
I believe you also testified you had an opportunity to look at the timeline of electronic devices, is that right?
That is correct.
What was the significance of that, if any, in forming your expert opinion?
So the timeline included text messages that went to and were from what was reported as Dylan's phone. And those messages, at least from Dylan to others, abruptly stopped sometime shortly after, I believe, about 9 o'clock on November the 18th of 2012.
So you look at all that, and now we'll transition to your examination of the cranium, if we can.
That's correct.
Can you please tell the jury what injuries, if any, did you observe on the cranium of Dylan Redwine?
There were fractures, which I would classify as perimortem fractures. And there were defects on a part of the right side of the cranium called the zygomatic arch. That to me had the appearance of an incised wound or a sharp force injury.
Can you tell the jury how you, in your work, define perimortem, please, as it relates to this case?
Sure. As a pathologist, antemortem is a term that we would use to describe things that took place during life. And when an injury is sustained during life, or with any type of a disease process, there is a response by the body. So since we're talking about bone in particular in this case, if a person sustains a bone fracture while they're alive, there are a number of different changes that take place. And the body will begin that healing process almost immediately. So there's bleeding that first takes place. There's a layer of a bone called the periosteum, which is a connective tissue layer that's on the top of the bone. There'll be bleeding in that area. And then after the bleeding takes place, then there's inflammation. And then the inflammatory process starts to break down the damaged bone. And then after the damaged bone has been broken down, then you start to see regrowth of new bone. And then as that regrowth of new bone forms, if the edges of the bone are in close approximation with each other, then will form what's called a fracture callus. And then ultimately over time, the bone will remodel, or it'll, if you will, absorb what was there, and then the bone will reform, or excuse me, return to a fairly normal structure and function. And if you look at bone, you can see whether or not it has undergone a healing process. So in the bones that I looked at with regard to Bill and Redwine, there had been no healing process. So as I use the term perimortem, if somebody sustains an injury immediately before death or immediately after death, then I may not be able to recognize the difference in bone. The one caveat with bone is that if the body remains well preserved, that perimortem period can extend out days, weeks, months, even years. And so if you take a look at, and part of that is based on the characteristics of bone, and I'm not sure if you want me to describe that now.
You know what, I'll ask you to pause for a moment, and I think it might be helpful for the jury if we could use Exhibit 374, which was previously admitted. Put that on the screen. There's a pointer to your left. Oh, that's the pen, actually. Oh,
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Doctor, I'm going to ask the court's permission for you to step down and walk us through what you're describing using Exhibit 374 on the screen, please.
And Dr. Kurtzman, if you would grab the microphone out and stand, you should just pull out. Thank you. Just stand off to the side for the jury.
Mr. Bogan, can you see?
Thanks for asking. I can see.
So what we're looking at, just for orientation purposes, is the front of the cranium. And the area that I'm pointing to, and I'm going to refer to this as the right side, even though it looks like I'm pointing to your left. So this is the right front of the cranium over the right side. And then what would be over the left side is over here on the right. So just the opposite. So just for clarification purposes, I'm referring to the anatomical side of the specimen that we're looking at. So this is sort of the getting closer to the top of the head. So this would be the nose down here, left side of the head, right side of the head. You'll see this squiggly line that runs over the top, and that's what's called the coronal suture. And then there is a squiggly line that runs to the back, and that's called the sagittal suture. Right? So those are not fractures. That's a normal structure that everybody has.
Dr. Kurtzman, oh, I'm sorry. You were perhaps about to point to it, but you described observing and analyzing a perimortem skull fracture. Can you show us where that is on 374?
So this is the fracture, which I would classify as perimortem. And there's another fracture that's contiguous with the coronal suture on the left, which I would also describe as a perimortem fracture. And the skull fractures in a couple of different ways. You take a look at the skull, you may have a simple linear fracture, or you may have a depressed skull fracture. So somebody who's struck, let's say, with a hammer, or with a pipe, or with a baseball bat. Sometimes you may see a portion of bone which is actually depressed. The linear fracture, I would classify this as a linear fracture, is irregular. And And basically, my interpretation of this would be a perimortem fracture as opposed to a postmortem fracture or let's say a fracture that has occurred long after death, long after the tissue is absent, and the bone has dried and desiccated.
How would it look to the jury if this was actually a postmortem fracture as opposed to perimortem skull fracture?
So postmortem fractures tend to be much more linear. Think of it if you had let's say, a ceramic pot, and if you were to drop that, then the lines that you would see are typically not crooked or winding. They're typically very straight. And then there may be tiny little chips that break off away from that. And that's because ceramic is very brittle. And if you take a look at the bone, in a post-mortem state, where the tissue is no longer present, the moisture has been lost, then what happens is that the bone has more of a characteristic like ceramic as opposed to bone during the living state or the immediate perimortem state. So bone, when we take a look at it, in the living state or in the time period right around the time of death, is actually very elastic. Bone can bend. And that's actually how our bone functions and constantly remodels during life. Is because bone is made up of connective tissue, collagen, and that collagen is where the hydroxyapatite is deposited. Hydroxyapatite is calcium, mostly calcium and phosphorus. There's obviously some other minerals, and it's that calcium and phosphorus, that mineral content, that really gives it the really kind of the hard structure. So in the post-mortem state, that's desiccated, all the moisture is lost. Sometimes that collagen is degraded, and you're left with just the mineral component. And so that's very, very brittle. It's not very elastic. And when it breaks, it typically breaks in straight lines and where it may have chips.
So you concluded that this was a perimortem skull fracture based on that.
Correct.
And what is a perimortem skull fracture of this nature consistent with, in your expert opinion?
So this can be associated with blunt force injury. So when I say blunt force injury, I'm talking about something that strikes the skull, or perhaps where the skull comes in contact with something else that's not moving, or some combination of the two. The other part about this cranium is that most of the face is absent. And so it could be because of one of two things, or perhaps a combination of both. It could be because of post-mortem predation. If you take a look at remains that are discovered in an outdoor setting, animals oftentimes have access and they will consume portions of the skeleton. And we would call that post-mortem predation. The other possibility is that perhaps it was trauma related. There's the type of fracture called a Laporte fracture, where the face, if you will, becomes dislocated from the rest of the cranium. So there's a couple of different Laporte fractures. Laporte fracture 1, which is just where the maxilla, think of where you have your upper teeth. Imagine if you were to just knock off that segment that contains your upper teeth. That would be a Laporte fracture 1. A Laporte fracture 2 is a fracture that goes up through the maxilla. The maxilla forms your upper part of your jaw. If that fracture crosses through up into the nose and the base of the organs, that would be considered a Laporte fracture 2. And a Laporte fracture 3 is where it crosses through the maxilla, but also includes the zygoma and across the top of the nasal bone, where your actual face, if you will, dislocated from the rest of the cranium. So if Dylan had sustained a Laporte fracture.
Your Honor, this part of the question respectfully is speculative. If Dylan had received, I don't believe that's flowing from any information or evidence before the jury or evidence before the expert. But now he's just positing
He's a-
speculation.
Yeah, he's an expert, and he can give different reasons why the rest of Dylan's space wasn't there. He's not saying that's what happened, it's just a possibility. I don't see a problem with it. Go ahead.
Go ahead, doctor, please.
Thank you. And so as Mr. Bogan was pointing out, I don't know that that happened. All I'm trying to account for is why that bone might be missing. And so it could be traumatic related, or it could be postmortem predation. I don't know. It's not available for me to look at, so I can't say with certainty.
And for the part of Dylan's skull, the cranium, that you were able to look at, you were able to conclude, in your expert opinion, it's perimortem skull fracture consistent with blunt force injury.
Asked and answered, leading.
You can answer the question.
Yes.
So, doctor, we're going to turn to number 377 on the screen. Just if you could just briefly take us through this and what significance it had in your determination as to the cause and manner of Dylan Redwine's death.
So this is a photograph that shows the left side of the cranium, and the front of the head is on the left side of the picture. The back of the head is on the right side of the picture. And what we can see is the coronal suture. We can see part of the sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture. And on the left side, contiguous with the coronal suture, there's a gap. And so that would be classified as a diastatic fracture. So simple fractures, depressed fractures, and diastatic fractures. Diastatic fracture is basically an area where the fracture extends through and it widens the sutures that are already present.
And this is a different part of the cranium than you were looking at in the previous exhibit, am I right? Different
Correct.
angle, different fracture.
Correct. So the fracture, the linear fracture that we saw on the left frontal area would be just out of sight from this side.
We're going to turn to 379, doctor. What is the jury looking at in exhibit 379 that was noteworthy for you?
On 379, this is the coronal suture, and you can see the fracture that extends from that point.
I'm going to turn to 382. What do we see here, Dr. Kurtzman?
So this photograph depicts the inner table of the bone. So this is the fracture, the right frontal fracture, excuse me, left frontal fracture, from the inside. And it also shows some of the normal anatomy that we would see on the interior of the cranium.
Thank you. You can have a seat, doctor.
Can I have 30 seconds with counsel real quick?
Sure.
Thank you, Judge.
Doctor, I'd like to talk to you just briefly about head injuries in your experience as a forensic pathologist and in determining cause and manner of death. Can you tell the jury, please, when you see a skull fracture consistent with the ones that you've described here, what kind of blood would you expect to see or not?
If it is a closed head injury without any defect to the skin, you may not see any blood. If it is a head injury that causes a laceration, then the skin is disrupted, and the skin of the scalp is quite vascular, and it will bleed pretty vigorously. And so, from the standpoint of bleeding outside of the body, Again, you need to have a defect in the skin for that to happen. But you don't always have to have a skin defect to sustain head injury. So if a person sustains a bruise on the scalp without breaking the skin, then that blood is contained. If we take a look a little bit deeper, if you have blood that accumulates under the periosteum, it would be called a cephalohematoma. Usually not something you would see in a 13-year-old. It's more commonly seen in infants and as a complication of childbirth or birth process. Then if we go a little bit deeper, the next layer would be what's called a epidural hematoma. And so in an epidural hematoma, what happens is usually there's a fracture which crosses one of the blood vessels that lines the inside of the skull. And when that fracture crosses the blood vessel lining the inside of the skull, it'll cause bleeding, and the bleeding will accumulate between the skull and what's called the dura mater, or the dura. I'll just say dura, D-U-R-A, just for simplification. And it will form a contained hematoma or blood space. And so when it does that, it's a space-occupying mass within the cranium, and therefore it can have life-threatening consequences if it's not treated properly. If a person has blunt force injury sustained and it causes the brain to move relative to the cranium, then it can cause what's called a subdural hematoma. And so just for description purposes, I'm holding up my right hand and I'm holding it in the shape of a fist. And we'll just imagine that that's the brain. And then I'm taking my left hand and I'm forming kind of a C shape around my right fist. And so if something strikes the head and accelerates the head, sorry about that. If something strikes the head and accelerates the head very quickly, the cranium will move, but the brain may not immediately. Think of it this way. If you're in a motor vehicle that's traveling, if you're not seatbelted in place, and you're traveling at the same velocity as the car, and if the car stops abruptly, you as a passenger will continue to move at the same velocity. And so you would go through the windshield, or you'd go through the window, or whatever else. Same thing happens with the head. So if something strikes the head really fast, or if somebody falls and the head stops really quickly, the brain is going to continue to move. And when it does move, it will tear small blood vessels that span between the surface of the brain and the dura. And when that happens, those small vessels can tear. And when they tear away, they will leak, and that will cause a subdural hematoma. Subdural because it's below the dura. If there's sufficient force and the brain comes in contact with the bone, either again with a fall or a blow with a hard object, sometimes that force will be transmitted and it will directly damage the surface of the brain, and we would call that a cerebral contusion, basically a brain bruise. And then the other thing that can happen, depending on how much movement is involved with the head, and if there's a rotational component, the brain can move around and can produce shearing injuries. And so we would call those gliding or intermediary contusions or diffuse axonal injury. So there's a broad spectrum of injuries that can occur. Some of them can be rapidly fatal. Some of them are injuries that can be survived. They may or they may not be associated with blood that's lost externally.
And is it possible for a blunt force injury that causes a skull fracture to result in someone's demise?
Absolutely, it's common.
And to be clear, doctor, during your examination, did you also see evidence of postmortem predation?
Yes, I did.
So I'd like to put 377 back on the screen. did you, or actually, I'm going to go to 379. As you looked at the skull, and I can refer you to 377 or 379, what examples could you provide to the jury of post-mortem predation? Excuse me.
So postmortem predation usually is seen as linear scores or marks on the bone, and can be produced by a variety of animals. And animals will gnaw on bone and chew on bone. And in this photograph, you can see on the surface of the bone, I'll say linear striations. And then there's some linear striations here as well. That would be pretty typical for postmortem predation.
How about on 377?
Same thing here. Let's take a look. We can see some linear markings, pretty common for gnawing on bone or chewing on bone. And it looks like some at the top and on the side here. This type of projection is a little bit more difficult to see.
But you did see some during your examination.
Yes, no question.
And 382, and I think I misspoke, and I appreciate flagging that for me. This is the inner view of where that skull fracture was. Did you see any evidence of animals gnawing on the remains after postmortem, after the Dylan Redwine's death?
So earlier today we were looking at what looked like a tooth puncture. It's not represented in this particular photograph. This does show fracture line, and you're also looking at vascular sulcites or sulcites basically. So these are basically tracks from the middle meningeal artery.
So you looked at the photographs that you also looked at as part of your analysis, and you were able to see what you saw back then, which some evidence of postmortem predation, but also the skull fractures that you described to the jury.
That's correct.
Which were perimortem.
Correct.
Doctor, you mentioned that you also identified and analyzed sharp force injuries. Is that right?
Correct. Do you want me to sit or continue?
If you'd like to have a seat, I'm going to ask you to stand up in just a minute or two, but you can have a seat.
I'll stay here.
Where did you see the sharp force injuries on the cranium of Dylan Redwine, Dr. Kurtzman?
They were present on a bone called the zygomatic arch, and it's on the right side.
I'm going to put 370 up back on the screen as 370 previously. What are we looking at in 370, Dr. Kurtzman?
We are looking at the right side of the cranium. And this hole that you see here is the external, well, what would be the external auditory canal. And so if you were to put your finger in your ear, if you put your pinky in your ear, obviously you can't go quite deep enough, wind up in that hole. So your ear is right around. This is the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch, and that's sort of your high cheekbone here. So it's running from back to front. So if you put your finger right in front of your ear and feel that ridge, that'll go right to your cheekbone. That's the zygomatic arch.
We go to 372, Doctor. What does the jury see in 372?
So what you're seeing here are two linear defects in the zygomatic arch. And so if you take a look at this defect, there's one surface.
Okay. You can move if you need to. Feel free to.
You can see one surface on the left. You can see another surface on the right, and they are parallel to each other. There's another defect just below or anterior to that. And it too has a surface that's linear on the back side, linear on the front side, and they're both parallel to each other. If you look at these from a different angle, you can see that these are wedge-shaped defects that come to an acute apex or a Y. Or actually, not a Y, D, excuse me. And that is a typical characteristic that you would see with knife marks on soft tissue and or both. One of the important characteristics for me in this particular case is that there's a piece of bone which is lifted up, and with a peripheral injury, because the bone is still flexible, it can bend, if you will, as it's being cut. In contrast to something that is hard and brittle, where it would likely chip off. And so for me, my interpretation of this is a perimortem injury that is typical of an incised or cut wound, as opposed to a stab. A stab wound, typically on the surface, is shorter than it is deep. So if I were to take, if I were to stab myself with this pointer, it would create a defect as wide as the pointer, but it could be, as long as the pointer is. So that would be a stab wound. An incised wound is a little bit different because the length of the wound on the surface is greater than the depth of the wound. So we have two parallel surfaces. We have a tangent injury. So this is oriented, if you take a look at the force that's applied, it is applied tangential to the skin surface. And so not directly, but rather tangential. So it is undermining the bone. And so in comparison to, let's say, post-mortem, if you take a look at rodents, rodents have teeth that are like chisels. A beaver. Not that a beaver would do anything, but just for purposes that you could, I think most people are familiar with beavers. If you take a look at a mountain lion, or if you take a look at a coyote, they have canine come to a point, although they're not a sharp apex point, slightly rounded at the surface. And if something is biting bone, more typically it would be a direct contact with bone, perpendicular. Not to say that it can't be gnawing and tangent, but it would be very difficult, in my opinion, not possible to create that pattern with a tooth. So I believe that it's consistent with a sharp horse injury.
And is that true for both of those marks there that are reflected by the yellow arrows, Dr. Kurtzman?
That is correct.
John, I'd like to approach with what's been previously marked as 389 and 390 for identification and provided to counsel.
All right,
If I may.
go ahead.
Dr. Kurtzman, did you also take photographs yourself when conducting the examination and analysis?
Yes, I did.
And did you take photos of the cut marks, the sharp force injuries you just talked about? And are those reflected in 389 and 390 that you're looking at?
Yes, they are.
And do those photographs fairly and accurately depict how those marks looked when you examined them in November of 2017?
Yes, they do.
John, at this time, if people move 389 and 390 into evidence, please.
Mr. Bogan,
No objection.
they're admitted.
And I'm going to put 389 on the screen, but Your Honor, this actually might be a good time to stop if the court wishes to take the afternoon break.
Why don't we do that? Let's start up again at 10 after 3. Everybody remember my admonitions not to talk to each other or anybody else about the case. And Everybody stand for the period, please. Right, we'll be in recess.
Thank you, Aaron.
All good, man. How deep you guys think you're gonna go in? All right. Okay, that's 375. my Kurtzman photos. Can I look at your stack and see what else is coming when you're done doing what you're doing?
All I'm putting in.
doing, Jonathan? All right, I'll do that. Whatever, I'm back. I'm back. Right on. Good to see you. Being a public servant, during the pandemic, and, tough month. You got it. We will call you. Is it mud season up there? Or is it still winter? I made another life back in the early '90s. Did the whole drive, Yellowstone, Glacier, Kootenai, Banff, Bolton. You're on that side of the state, right? Probably. Yes. And then the other remodel. Oh, I wanna go. Let me install it. Yeah. Sounds like. Oh, you like. I bet it's the same in Montana as it is in Colorado. You can take a night class. Yeah. I'm being hyperbolic. Same thing. They're accepting. Not the same.
Thank you.
I'll see you on the stand.
We are. Bring them up. You can be seated or stand, whatever you want to do. Oh, you can stand. Come on in. Everybody rise, please. Okay, we can be seated. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, right before the break, we had introduced number 389 and 390 into evidence in the report submission, published 389.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Kurtzman, is this one of the photographs that you took at the time you did your analysis?
Yes, it is.
And what's the significance of what we see in 389?
So this is the right zygomatic arch, which we talked about earlier, which has the linear defects. And we can see one linear defect here. And then we can see another defect here that, in my opinion, was altered by a casting process that had taken place before I had a chance to examine the skull. And so this is different when compared to the previous photos that we looked at. And the first defect, which I described, the one which is a little bit more posterior, retains its characteristics where it's parallel, V-shaped apex curve, and again, tangential to the bone surface. In this portion of the bone, what is exposed is the cut surface of the bone. So where a sharp-edged instrument would have cut through the bone, the small portion of tissue or bone that was lifted away, in my opinion, was present on the previous photograph that we looked at. Again, in my opinion, this plate of bone was lifted off once the casting material was removed. And that would partially underscore the concept of a post-mortem artifact as opposed to a peri-mortem artifact. Because peri-mortem, so recently after death, the bone is still moist, it retains its elasticity, it can bend, and you can cut bone with a knife. And so the bone was cut, and a portion of the bone that was lifted off was still present on the bone when Dr. France first documented and photographed the specimen, but then it was casted. This is a delicate plate of bone that's now dried and brittle, and it just snapped off. It would have just snapped off. You're welcome.
Dr. Kurtzman, we're going to break that down a little bit. You were aware that the photographs we were just looking at prior to the break, were taken by Dr. France, right?
That's correct.
And she took those photographs before she did the casting or molding process.
That's correct.
And then after the photographs were taken and the documentation was collected, she then tried the casting process.
That's correct.
And you believe the casting process had an impact on what you later observed in November of 2017.
That's correct.
What was the difference between what you looked at in the photographs and what we see in 389?
The only difference, again, in my opinion, there's a small flake of bone that has been removed. It does not change my opinion about the pattern of the injury and its significance.
I think you were just hitting on how this reflected, the change, reflected a post-mortem change.
Correct.
Can you explain that, please?
Again, bone in somebody who is alive is elastic. It's a tissue. It's not as soft as soft tissue, but it does have some elasticity. Our bones are constantly changing, and they have to have some change in order to constantly remodel and age. If a bone sustains a sharp force injury or a fracture, it's flexible. So it'll initially be sort of elastic and bendy, and then at some point in time, it'll reach a more plastic stage where you bend it and it retains that stage. And then you go on to further application of force, and then that will cause a fracture. In the case of the knife is basically shaving off this connective tissue, this collagen, which happens to be impregnated with hydroxyapatite, which is the calcium and phosphate. So that makes it hard, but it still maintains the elastic quality. You can cut a bone and have a small flap of bone that lifts it up. When the bone is dry, so it no longer has any moisture content, it is desiccated. And or if it loses any of that collagen content and it retains only the mineral content, it's hard and it's brittle. It's like a piece of ceramic. It has no flexibility whatsoever. And so in that case, that's now a tiny little flap of bone, which at one point in time was flexible and elastic, but it no longer is, because it's clearly post-mortem. It's dried, it's desiccated, and because it's a small piece of bone, and if you apply casting material over the top, it may break that off.
So fair to say the cuts are perimortem caused by sharp force injury, but the change between Dr. France's photos, casting, and your examination reflect a post-mortem change in how that would look on the bone.
That's correct.
And specifically, what changes did you identify in the cuts themselves, or what differences did you see from the photos that Dr. France took and when you examined the cranium of Dylan Redwine?
So again, with the photograph that Dr. France took, the small piece of bone is covering the surface here. So you can see what looks like kind of a divot. And there's a flat surface, which is, the surface that has been sized. So I'm going to change my position here. So a knife blade, so just for the purpose of demonstration, now I'm standing on the right side of the photograph. I've got my pointer, and I am moving my pointer. So this would be the back of the skull, this is the front of the skull. I'm moving my pointer from back to front, and it would be tangential to the bone surface, so shaving, almost slicing the piece of bone. And the only difference between the photograph that Dr. France has and the photograph that I made is that this small chip of bone, which was concealing the surface, is now removed. So this is actually, in some ways, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but in this case, it did demonstrate that surface.
And what effect, if any, did the casting process have on your expert opinion in this case?
It did not. I didn't agree with the casting process being done before everybody had had a chance to look at it, because it altered it, but it didn't hurt anything expected in terms of my opinion.
We're going to go to 390.
Same photograph with slightly different lighting. So I used the blue lighting in the photograph before, and you can see the cut mark. And then there's a more direct lighting that doesn't show the second cut mark as well.
And that leads to my next question. Is it, as we look at different photos, does it also change based on the type of lighting, type of camera, angle of photograph, and so on?
Absolutely.
Doctor, you can have a seat. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you've already testified that these marks, in your expert opinion, were caused by a sharp object. And you touched on some of the differences between these and what you would see in scavengers. And I'm just hoping that we could do that with the jury. I'm going to put 375 on the screen. In 375, which is on the screen, Doctor, do you see any examples of a bite mark or post-mortem predation?
Yes, I do.
Of course, willing to allow you to step down, I would ask you to do so.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to magnify this picture, but I'll first call your attention to, and this is a photograph that's depicting the inside of the cranium. So what would be next to the brain? This is the left side of the head. This is the right side of the head. This is the front side. And so we can see in the top left portion of the photograph, which I'm pointing to. And if we, perfect, thank you very much. So what we can see when we take a look at this is that it's sort of a round, sort of an oval defect. You can see that there are cracks, linear defects around that defect. And, you know, we talk about bone in the skull. There's a flat surface of compact bone on the outside. There's the middle portion, which is trabecular bone, which is more soft bone. And then on the inner table, we have that compact bone surface. And so when force is applied to the outer table or the inner table of the bone, that cortical surface may break. And when it breaks, if it's flexible, as you can see in a peri-mortem state where somebody who's alive, the bone will bend and crack. And so that's what it's done here. And so this is consistent with post-mortem predation. So a tooth is generally, a canine tooth is generally round or oval in its cross-sectional contour. And so you could expect to see a defect like that. Alternatively, it could be anything that's round, so that it could be potentially an instrument that causes that defect. I would say more likely, in this case, probably post-mortem predation. But bottom line is it's a peri-mortem defect. And I'll compare that. So there's a hole up here. You can take a look at. If you take a look at that hole, that would be a foramen, which is a anatomical term for a hole in bone through which blood vessels, and nerves, arteries may pass through. If you take a look at that, the characteristics of this hole are different than this defect. These are smooth, these are rounded. It's not associated with trauma whatsoever. It's just a normal finding that you would see.
So the marks that we focused in on here that you've been talking to the jury about reflect, in your opinion, post-mortem predation.
Correct. It would be, I would say, it's most probable that it is post-mortem predation. It couldn't exclude with 100% certainty some type of mechanical defect, but more likely post-mortem predation.
And then here we have the peri-mortem skull fracture on the right side of the cranium.
That's correct. And so that's this irregular line. And I'll just point out, this looks like a ridge running down the middle. This is just a normal anatomic structure. This is the frontal bone.
And I say right, because I'm thinking about looking at the picture, but that's actually the left front.
It's the left frontal bone.
Now, doctor, you can have a seat. Thank you. I'll take 375 down. Have you had, sorry, I'll wait for it. Have you had the opportunity to look at scavenger marks on bones during the course of your career?
Many times.
When you say many, give the jury a feel for how many times you've seen scavenger marks on bones that you've examined during the course of your medical career.
Hundreds of times. Beginning with my first exposure to that investigation at the medical examiner's office beginning in 1983, we would receive skeletonized remains. And those were skeletonized remains in a variety of situations: homicide, accident, suicide, natural deaths. And I've continued that through to today. And we regularly respond to scenes. We will oftentimes work with forensic anthropologists as a part of the team. And we're typically engaged in the processing of remains that are not completely skeletonized. So as an example, if an individual has sustained a significant injury that we know has affected the bone, oftentimes what we will do is remove the tissue to expose the bone and then look at the bone surface to provide better characterization of the characteristics of the mark that are present. And so when we talk about characteristics, you can talk about class characteristics. If you use a saw blade, saw blades have different types of patterns, and you can see that in bone. And you can distinguish different classes. So a sharp force injury, like an incised wound, is different than a mark that's made with a saw. And then within each class,
And Judge, I'm going to object to this portion of the testimony. It's going beyond what he's been qualified as an expert on. He has not been qualified in tool mark analysis. Tool mark analysis.
Well, I'm not sure this is tool mark analysis. He's a forensic pathologist. He's qualified to talk about manner and cause of death and what causes it. And he's also talked about his previous study in bone pathology. I don't remember exactly what the term was. I think he's qualified to do it. So, objections noted, no rule.
So just briefly, whenever we're looking at a case to determine cause and manner of death, if it's traumatic, regardless if it's accident, suicide, homicide, or otherwise, we want to try to identify the characteristics that are there. And so we do make a great effort to look at that and document that. And that can be with regular photography. It can be with photography using a dissecting microscope. It can be facilitated with electron microscopy. Sometimes it can be facilitated with high-resolution computerized tomography or CT scans. And so essentially we're trying to document and preserve that information.
You've seen hundreds of cases involving scavenger marks. How do these cut marks differ from those?
Scavenger marks, again, have a different pattern. If you're looking at a rodent with chisel-shaped teeth, it is typically a flat, excoriated portion of the bone. If you are looking at something like a bear or a coyote or a wolf or a fox, they have canine teeth. And so the canine teeth are pointy, but again, not to a perfect apex. They're slightly rounded at the edge. And you could say the same thing for claw marks. Although claw marks, typically, if you look at claws are made of keratin. Keratin is the same thing that makes up our nails, makes up our hair, not as hard as bone. So teeth, because they also contain hydroxyapatite that makes it really hard, that can easily score or damage the bone surface.
Doctor.
That is correct.
And when I say postcranial and you say postcranial, what we're talking about is remains beneath the head, correct?
That's correct.
Under the head, cranium, head, postcranial, everything below, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then after that viewing, you did a more thorough analysis and then wrote a report, a letter, if you will, to Lieutenant Azell, in 2017, correct?
That is correct.
And that was in November 2017, right?
That's when I did the examination. That's correct.
Right. And that's when you did the examination of the skeletal remains, right?
Correct. So all of the remains that I saw in 2013 were present for me to view once again, with the exception that the cranium was not present when I first viewed the remains in 2013 because it had not yet been discovered. So I had a chance to look at the cranium and all the other bones.
And your examination of the remains in 2017, that was done at the behest of the district attorney's office, correct?
That is correct.
And that was 2 years after the cranium was found, correct?
That is correct.
And that was at least 4 years after the post-cranial remains were found, correct?
That is correct.
And that was after Mr. Mark Redwine had been indicted, correct?
That is correct.
And you talked about the materials you relied upon in informing your opinion as to cause and manner of death, and I want to revisit that. As you testified to, one of the items that you relied upon in your report, in your analysis, informing your opinion, was Dr. France's report from 2015, correct?
That is correct.
And that included the report and all the photos that you looked at associated with that report taken by Dr. France, right?
Correct. Although I'll add one point of clarification. There are photographs that are included in Dr. France's report, and those are the photographs that I looked at. So there were additional photographs that Dr. France had. I did not view those prior to preparing my report.
And as you testified, you also relied on a map of Middle Mountain with distance deemed relevant to the death investigation, correct?
That is correct.
And that map and those distances were put together by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct. Or at least I believe that they were.
And you also relied on the probable cause affidavit regarding the extradition of Mark Redwine, correct?
I read that.
Right. You read that, and you listed it as one of the things that you relied upon in forming your opinions here, correct?
Correct.
And that's another document that was drafted by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct.
You said you relied on a timeline of electronic devices.
That is correct.
And that was a document that was prepared by law enforcement.
That is correct.
You also relied on something that you identified as work product authored by Jim Azell and Antonio Goldbright. Obviously, that was prepared by law enforcement as well.
Correct.
And you relied on a drawing of the first floor and a drawing of the second floor of Mr. Redwine's house, right?
That is correct.
And those diagrams were produced by law enforcement.
That is correct.
As were the photographs of luminol that you relied upon in your report.
That is correct.
And the photographs of the white Dodge truck, those were taken by law enforcement as well.
That is correct.
And a chart of skeletal and personal items of Dylan Redwine, that was prepared by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct.
And last item you relied upon was an email from law enforcement as well, correct?
That is correct.
So out of the 12 things you relied upon in your opinion, one of them was the report of another doctor, Dr. France. 10 of them were prepared by law enforcement. And the other thing you relied upon in your analysis was your own examination of the remains, correct?
That's correct. And if I may, with any case that
I think you answered my question. I don't know if this drifts into the whole truth, but I think you've answered my question, Judge. And I say that sincerely. I'm not trying to be a pill.
Well, it's follow it up on cross-examination.
Redirect, Your Honor?
Redirect, excuse me, redirect.
Sure, thank you.
Permission to approach with defense 1748, 1749, 1750, 1752, 1755, 1756, 1757, 1761, 1766, 1769.
Let me catch up with you just a second. You may.
Your Honor,
Yes.
if I may.
Yes.
Just to expedite things, these are all photographs from Dr. Francis' report. The prosecution's provided to the defense previously. Some, perhaps many of them are already in evidence, but in an effort to expedite everything, the people would stipulate to the admission of any photographs that are actually used during the examination of Dr. Christman.
All right, so 1748, 49, 50, 52, 55, 56, 57, 61, 66, and 69 are admitted. Go ahead, Mr. Logan.
Doctor, these are the photos from Dr. Francis' report that you said you relied upon amongst all the other items informing your opinion. Please familiarize yourself with those, and we'll talk about them.
So defense exhibit 1748 shows the front of the cranium.
I'm not asking you to test, I'm just asking you to get familiar with them.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Now, before we get into the photos,
Hold on just a second, would you? Go ahead and finish up there. There's a lot of them there. Okay, go ahead.
before we get into the photos, the report that you relied upon, drafted by Dr. France, noted that there were many fractures on the edge of the segment, many of which can be most conservatively explained by scavenging, correct?
It can be scavenging. It could be perimortem injury. I can't state with certainty.
Right. But the report that you relied upon, Dr. Francis said, they can most conservatively be explained by scavenging, referring to the fractures on the edges of the segment, meaning the cranium, correct?
Your Honor, I asked and answered. I think Dr. Christman just answered the question.
I don't think you did. That's why I had to ask it again.
No, I thought he did, but you can answer again.
So essentially, the information that's contained in Dr. France's report is Dr. France's opinion. And as a forensic pathologist, I like to form my own opinion based upon what I see and observe. And so Mr. Bogan is absolutely correct. I did rely on these pieces of information to look at, but I'm forming my own opinion based on the content. So I may or may not, I may or may not agree with everything that's contained.
And moving on to the photographs, I want to show you a couple here. I'm going to ask to publish 1748 and 1749.
Go ahead. You may as well just keep that to your den. It'll be faster.
I won't take it with me.
Well, don't do that. That'd be a problem for us.
Now, Doctor, if we look on the left, that's one of the photos that you already testified about today and was included in Dr. France's report, correct?
Correct.
And what that shows is the fracture on the left side of the frontal bone, and Dr. France even put an arrow there, correct?
That's correct.
And when I say left side of the frontal bone, that means left side of the frontal bone, not the viewer's left, right?
That's correct. Left side of the decedent's face, the forehead.
And we can see the other side of that fracture in the other photo, which Dr. France labeled as figure 11, correct?
That is correct.
And can you point that out to the jury? Okay. And then also on figure 11, we can see that the puncture marks, what you were talking about just a few moments ago, where they are in relation to that fracture on the inside, right?
That's correct. It's on the opposite side.
And using your medical expertise of,
Sure.
can you show approximately on the outside of the cranium on figure 1 where those puncture marks would be? Is that something you're comfortable doing?
Sure. It'd be right in this area. So this hole right here, you see right there?
And that's a naturally occurring hole we know as a foramen, correct?
Correct. That's natural occurrence. That is this hole. So this defect is right about here, on the right side.
And I think this will go faster if I can approach, Judge.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll share the microphone with you.
I'll speak loud. How's that? Please explain to the jury what this process is right here and what it connects to on a healthy cranium.
So that's the anterior portion of the zygomatic arch. And so it goes back and forth between the two. And part of it's broken away.
And when you say anterior, you mean towards the front, right?
That's correct. So anterior is the front of the body. Superior is the top. Inferior is below. And posterior is behind, if I use those terms.
And when we're talking about the zygomatic arch, anterior, you've already been done once. You tell me where I'm pointing in the wrong place. The anterior part of the zygomatic arch, you said, is kind of your upper cheekbone, correct?
Correct. May I approach you, Mr. Bogan?
By all.
Would you mind moving your glasses? So the zygomatic arch is going from, so this little bump is called the tragus, and it goes all the way up that way. So it's an arch. It's an extension off the temporal bone.
And if I ask the record to reflect that you were basically running your finger, the area between kind of my right eye and my right ear, generally where that arch is.
That's correct.
And we see the inferior portion of that arch right there, right on the left side of the big one.
That is correct.
And we can also see it right here as well, right?
Correct.
And is there any way you can estimate the distance between those punctures, those bite marks, and the fracture?
So when we say bite marks, the only thing we've looked at is this specific bite mark.
By all means.
Singular. And so in terms of the distance, let's see. So maybe a couple of inches. Hard to say. I don't know exactly what plane this is. This measuring device is.
Okay.
So if it's farther behind, it's going to have a difference on the interpretation of the distance. Or if it's closer, then that would also have an impression. But But if we were to just use this as a single standard, what it is worth, we're looking at this bottom part is a half an inch. And so, say that's a half an inch. If we assume that the bite mark is someplace over here, because that's that framing, so we've got, let's say, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5 inches, understanding that this was curving away from the plane. Well, I don't know exactly how far, but let's say.
Give or take 1.5 inches on the fly in court with a lawyer asking you to figure this out.
Sure.
I'm going to ask to publish $17.50, $52.
You can publish all of these, just
Thank
go
you.
ahead and do it.
Thank you. You testified about this diagram, and it was also, or this photograph, and it's also a photograph on Dr. France's report, correct?
Mr. Doherty, I have to apologize, who's got your name? Michael, he published a different photograph. This photograph, I looked at earlier, but I asked not to use that photograph because there's discoloration on the surface of the cranium. And this is the fracture, which is actually in front of or anterior to, not this dark area.
And you testified about this fracture, and let's do some more anatomy here real quick. The suture on the left side of the photograph is the coronal suture, right?
That's correct.
Naturally occurring phenomena in just about everyone, right?
That's correct.
Where the two bones kind of fuse together.
That's correct. And what happens is that when you think of the skull, it's not one bone. It's actually formed by many different bones that actually grow together. And so at those intersections where the bones grow together, it forms a suture. And that's that irregular spot there. And sutures are frequently a point of weakness for the bone.
And that's kind of my next point. I believe during direct, you described this as a diastatic fracture, correct?
That's correct.
And break that down for us in layperson terms one more time, please.
So when we were looking at the linear fracture through the frontal bone, that was coursing through bone, not involving a suture. If forces are applied to the cranium and those forces incorporate where a suture is located, since that's a point of weakness to start off with already, then it's more easy to develop a fracture through that location. And so it be considered a diastatic fracture. Sometimes it's completely separated.
And
so you might see, for some people, this would be completely broken off.
Weaker part of the cranium is the suture, right? If I understand you correctly.
Correct.
And these sutures are a naturally occurring phenomena that get stronger as people get older, correct?
They tend to be, they never really obliterate completely, but they become less defined. So when you start off as a baby, when they're young, they're wider. And then as you get older, they get narrower and narrower and narrower, almost to the point where you can't perceive them anymore.
And safe to say, a child or an adolescent's sutures are going to be less strong than an adult's, correct?
I mean, to some extent. I mean, your skeleton is maturing up until your 20s. And he's 13, so he's an adolescent.
So that's going to be a less strong suture than in a full-grown adult male.
Correct. And the bone is not as robust, it's not as thick.
And any fracture is going to follow the point of least resistance, weakest part of the bone, right? That's where a fracture, that's how a fracture travels, correct?
Correct. And it also is in part dependent on how the force is applied. So when a force is applied, there'll be vector forces that will propagate in different directions. And so there's a variety of different mechanisms that might be produced to see different types of fractures.
And you described another kind of fracture, and I didn't catch the name of it, but you said it's what occurs when someone gets hit by a hammer or something and it causes a dent, or I would assume some sort of like almost spider web pattern in a cranium.
Correct. So I call that a depressed skull fracture. And so a depressed skull fracture would be, again, either an individual falling and striking their head on a hard surface, and or being struck in the head with something that's hard. And so depending on the characteristics of that surface, so if it happens to be round like a ball peen hammer, it may be concentrated in there. If it is like a roofing hammer where it's flat and round, you might see depression that looks like that. If it's a baseball bat, then elongated, or maybe there's a steel rod like my pointer here. If somebody hit with a steel rod, that could produce a depressed skull fracture.
Baseball bat, steel rod, hammer. We could probably spend the rest of the afternoon listing the implements that could cause a depression fracture.
That's correct.
Okay. And you didn't see any depression fractures on any of the elements in these remains, correct?
Correct. Again, albeit that we only have a portion of the range. So what's here, I didn't see any depressed skull fracture.
And is this one, this is a close-up of the same fracture to the coronal suture, right? Does that give everyone a better idea of what we're talking about here?
Correct. And that's a better picture because the arrow's pointing to the extension along the suture, not this area of pigmentation.
These are also photos that were included in Dr. France's report as well, correct?
That's correct.
And
Yes.
and what we know from your own observations and from Dr. France's report is that there's animal scavenging marks in figure 10 here, the superior part of the cranium, correct?
Correct.
And when we're talking superior, that's the top, right? Can you point those out to the jury, please?
So it's these linear striations that you see on the top of the head. So this would be the top left side of the head.
And there's similar striations like that on the posterior as well, correct?
There are. I've seen them in the photographs. At least in this form of presentation, it's more difficult to see. So linear defects like this, maybe this. It's better when I'm looking at something that's printed. Printed. And the reason being is that if you look at a screen like this, it's projected light. And the resolution that you see with a screen like this is not as great as the resolution that you would see on a printed piece of paper. On a printed piece of paper, it's usually 300 dots per inch. So it's very, very fine detail. If you were to look at a photo that's printed in a newspaper, for instance, resolution is not as great, so it looks kind of grainy. And so, yes, there are striations that are consistent with postmortem predation in these photographs. If you look at the photographs, you can't as easily point them out in this method of presentation.
And you can have a seat for a while. I'm going to take that down. Now, one of your observations of the cranium when you wrote your report was that it had been subject to a casting process, right?
That's correct.
And you even noted that the effects that casting process had on the cranium. You mentioned at least one of them during direct.
That's correct.
And we'll get to that in a moment. But another issue that you spotted was the fact that there had been residual casting material left on the cranium, correct?
That's correct.
And explain to the jury what that means.
Some of the casting material is adherent, and it remains on the surface of the cranium as opposed to coming away with the cast.
And how did you know that you were looking at casting material and not bone or dirt or something like that?
The appearance to me was not something that I would expect to see in nature or in an environment where there's, I'll say, forest floor material, that dust that covers on a forest floor. You could see bark, you could see leaves, you could see dirt. This material was adherent to the surface, and it was white, and it had the characteristics that I commonly associate with some types of casting material.
And I'm going to ask to approach with defendants 1794.
You may. And this can be admitted?
Sorry, Your Honor, I haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
Yes, Your Honor, this is one of the photos that the prosecution provided, and I stipulated to its submission to move things along.
1794 is admitted.
Thank you.
Is that one of the photos you took of the cranium during your November 22nd, 2017 examination?
Yes, it is.
And can you see some casting material in the cranium there?
Correct. There's material there which I would categorize as casting material.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to stand up and point the casting material out to the jury, please.
If you take a look at the bone surface, you can see bright white areas. There's actually some little flecks of blue, little flecks of red, and those are deposited in areas where the bone surface is not smooth and even. So in areas where the bone is smooth and even, the casting material has not adhered. However, in other areas, so we can see some areas that are consistent with post-mortem predation. There are some defects here which I question the possibility as possibly a sharp force defect, but I can't really render that opinion because it's in part covered with casting material, and in part, at least in this photograph as published, I can't see the surface characteristics as well.
And while we're on the topic of that, Mark, you cannot say with any scientific certainty that that's a tool mark or can be attributed to a man-made device.
No, I would not be able to state that with certainty.
In fact, you've even said it's inconclusive in your own report, correct?
Correct.
Permission to approach and publish 1768.
You may approach.
Your Honor, the people stipulate to the emission of 1768.
1768 is admitted.
Can you point out any casting material in this? Can you point out any casting material in 1768 as well?
Once again, I would just point out the areas that appear bright, they're punctate or somewhat linear, along areas that have some striations.
One seven nine six. Emission and publication.
People stipulate on 1796, Your Honor. Thank you.
Admitted.
Now, in this one, describe to the jury what side of the cranium we're looking at.
This is the right side of the cranium, so the right side of the seating head. And here's the external auditory canal or meatus, and that is filled with casting.
And if I blow it up, does that make it easier to see?
Correct. And if you wanted to refer back to the other photographs, which had no casting material, you could see that that's a dark hole.
Right.
You can see now that it's filled.
So describe for the jury where on the cranium you observed this casting material getting stuck, generally speaking.
On the surfaces, mostly around the front, and on the right side of the ear, on the zygomatic arch. And when I say zygomatic, right zygomatic arch, where I interpreted the defects as being cut marks.
1798 for admission and publication.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. And if all these pictures are from Dr. Kirkman's examination and the prosecution provided to the defense, we're not going to object to any of these coming into evidence, just to move the process along.
1798 admitted.
And show the jury on yourself what we're looking at here again, as far as right zygomatic root and all that.
So this is it's blurry here because it's not in the same plane of focus, but this is the right external auditory canal or meatus, and that's filled with casting material. And then this is the right zygomatic arch, and then this is the cut. This is the other cut, and we can see white particulate matter on the edge of the zygoma, which is interrupted.
And I'm zooming in on that. When you say white particulate matter, we're talking about casting material there, correct?
That's how I would interpret that, yes.
Okay. And can you point that out now that we've zoomed in on it a little bit? All right. Have a seat. Seeking to publish and introduce by stipulation 1775.
It is.
I want to talk about the differences you observed in the zygomatic arch that you photographed and how those differed from the photographs you saw in Dr. Francis' report. To do that, I'm going to publish 1775 and figure 8 from Dr. Francis' report, already admitted by stipulation 1761. Haven't asked a question yet.
I won't say anything.
Safe to say Dr. Francis' photo from the report is on the viewer's left, correct?
That's correct.
And we see the two marks here and here, moving from left to right, or posterior to anterior down the arm.
So if we're looking at the side of the person's head, the defect here on the lower right is more anterior, and it's the front. So we're moving from front to back to the second defect.
And on the right side,
Same thing.
is the photo you took, right?
Right. So this defect that I'm pointing to, which is the more posterior, is the same as the one that's more to the left. And this defect, which again I believe has been altered, is this defect here. And what I believe took place is, again, this, in my opinion, is a sharp force injury tangent to the bone surface, so it's a shaved portion of bone away from the cortex. But it has not been disrupted, hasn't been taken off. In this photograph, I believe that the flake of bone that's been partially shaved off has snapped off.
Safe to say, what we're talking about here, when you look at the top of Dr. Francis' photograph, there's kind of a semicircle in this photograph. Just same here in this one, correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
Wait. Objection?
Okay.
The council's question about just not here, I think council's starting to testify and he should be asking a question of Dr. Kurtz.
I think that's right. So watch in the future, but, well, actually, this is cross-examination, right? I think you can ask leading questions, which I think is allowed, so.
Your Honor,
I think it's a lead.
To me, it's a leading question more than what was happening earlier today.
And Your Honor, I believe I can answer the question.
You can now.
Well, let me ask it.
Sure.
Yeah, what appears to be a semicircle here on the right mark, correct?
Correct.
And there's not a feature like that on the right mark here, correct?
That's correct. And there's a reason for that.
I think
This is a curved surface. And so this is a distinctly linear marking to me. And so even though this appears as a curve, it's just a cut of the contour that the sharp force is applied to. So if I were to, we don't have an apple here. If I were to cut an apple, not in half, but if I were to shave a portion of that apple off, and if I were to look at that cut perpendicular to that shave, it would look perfect. So I don't doubt for a moment, as Mr. Bogan has said, this looks like a curve. But in my opinion, it is tangential. It is a straight, sharp portion.
But you do agree, and you've testified several times today, that a portion of the bone there on the second mark is gone.
Correct.
In your opinion.
Exactly.
And in your opinion, it flaked off, correct?
That's correct.
And can we move on from this now? It's about, I don't know how many times you've done this.
I'd have to look at the term.
Well, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you we're moving on.
Go ahead and have a seat.
Sure. Thank you.
And without talking about the comparison, I do want to ask a couple follow-up questions regarding, in your opinion, the causation of that part of the bone being missing.
Correct.
And what you testified to today is that you believe that molding process is consistent with a post-mortem defect, post-mortem injury, with the bone flaking, snapping off, correct?
That is correct.
And as we all know, you wrote a report in this case, correct?
That's correct.
And you knew this was the Dylan Redwine case, and you knew that Lieutenant Dizelle had asked you for this information, right?
Yeah, let's just move on. You don't need to do that, okay?
Nowhere in your report does it say that that missing bone can be attributed to a post-mortem injury from molding, correct?
I don't recall specifically. I'd have to refresh my memory by looking at the report. I believe I have it worded there.
I respectfully turn your attention to page 2 of your report. Full paragraph, first one.
So I did comment that one defect, right zygoma, appeared altered from photographs published in the anthropology report prepared by Dr. Diane France. And so that would be essentially saying the same thing, that it's different than when she had it in the photographs that she first made prior to any casting attempts.
But your report does not attribute that missing bone to a post-mortem injury. It does not say that in your report that you wrote.
No, I didn't say that.
I want to talk about the process by which you got involved in this case. And you've already testified. It sounds like you came in an official capacity in November of 2017, correct?
That is correct. There was typically forensic pathologists or medical examiners or coroners will render opinions regarding cause and manner of death. And that was the purpose for my being incorporated in the case.
So obviously you weren't involved in this case from the get-go, from when the remains were found, certainly not from when the cranium was found.
Inconsistently. It was never a case that was referred to me by the La Plata County Coroner's Office.
And the case got referred to you when exactly?
There was discussion about the case, again, within a couple of days. Jan Smith, the La Plata County coroner, had indicated to me that bones had been discovered. And She implied to me that she was not in custody of the remains, that there was not anything for me to specifically have as a case to accept. And so I of course heard about the case at that point in time, but was not directly involved to participate in the direction of how the material would be handled. And then I saw the remains at the college here in town. And then the next time I saw the remains was in November of 2017.
And when you do this sort of examination, you like to get the remains in as pristine as condition as possible, correct?
Correct. But
Explain to the jury why that's important for a forensic pathologist to get the remains in pristine, unaltered condition.
by law, in the state of Colorado, when human remains are discovered that are not part of an anthropologic examination, so we're not looking for Native American or how should I say, indigenous peoples remains, those remains have to be brought to the attention of the coroner and law enforcement and the medical examiner as appropriate. When that happens, the medical examiner has the opportunity to be a part of that death investigation from the very beginning. And it is common for us to incorporate anthropologists and, in fact, forensic anthropologists. And so that can be used collectively for the determination of cause and manner of death. If it was somebody who was not skeletonized, obviously I would have been involved at the very beginning. In this case, the remains were skeletonized. Dr. Mulhern had had a chance to look at the remains. Dr. France had had a chance to look at the remains. Aside from the casting material, in my opinion, there was nothing different about the remains. You know, at the beginning, ultimately, until I had a chance to see them again, with the exception of the casting material. Having said that, it has not altered my opinion. I certainly would have handled things differently had I been involved from the very beginning, but it ultimately doesn't change my opinion with regard to cut marks on the zygoma.
And you're aware that after the cranium was found, that Dr. Mulhorn looked at it, and actually you looked at it, or no, strike that. After the cranium was found, that Dr. France looked at it, Dr. France looked at it again. It was sent to Texas for DNA, and they cut a piece out of it. It was sent to Quantico for tool mark analysis, and then it arrived for you to analyze after it had been through all those possessions, cleanings, and processes, correct?
Correct. I don't know all the specific details. By November of 2015, I had already moved to, or was in the process of moving to Montana.
And in your professional opinion, Jan Smith, the La Plata County coroner, should have been contacted as soon as these remains were determined not to be human, correct?
You mean she should have been contacted when it was identified that they were human?
Right.
Yes.
Touche.
Yes.
And in fact, it struck you, in your professional opinion, that the La Plata County Sheriff's Department was in a rush to get these remains identified as human and to get DNA testing as well. That's two questions.
You know, this was a case that involved a missing 13-year-old boy, and there was certainly a urgent desire to confirm the identity of the remains. I'm not sure if I would say rush necessarily. I suppose you could say that urgent and rush equate to the same thing.
Well, you did meet with the Jefferson County Chief Deputy District Attorney and talked about this case.
Objection, Your Honor.
Impeachment, and laying foundation for a prior and inconsistent statement.
I think that's probably all right, unless you have some different, I'm not sure what your objection is.
Your Honor, I'm objecting because I believe the witness just said urgent and rush equate to the same thing. So if the impeachment's about whether he used the word urgent or rush when he was interviewed 2 years ago, I think we've already covered it, and we would move on.
Is this about that issue? Mr. Bogan? Is this about rush versus urgent?
Absolutely. This is a doctor who's a wordsmith,
No,
and
we're moving on.
Thank you, Your Honor.
during your direct testimony, and I'm going to revisit a couple of concepts here before I wrap up for the afternoon. You spoke about one general concept, and that is the concept of peri-mortem. Remember talking about that a couple hours ago?
Correct.
And as you told this jury, peri-mortem represents that time that can be before death, during death, or after death, correct?
That's correct.
And you even told this jury that that peri-mortem phase in bones can last days, weeks, months, and you said even years past death, right?
That's correct.
And that's a definition of peri-mortem, the one that I've just described, and then you affirmed that you share with Dr. France, correct?
I don't know what Dr. France's opinion specifically, but if that's what she said, then yes, I would agree with that.
Would reviewing her report help you refresh your recollection to her
Honor.
definition of peri-mortem?
I mean, she testified, they know what she said.
Well,
I mean, what's the point of this?
Well, I'm getting there, Judge, and it has to do with ante-mortem, peri-mortem, and post-mortem, as this witness.
What does the opinion that he needs to look at a report? I mean, they know what she said.
And I'm asking, and one of the things he said on direct, Your Honor, I mean, I don't know if you want to have this at the bench or not, because,
No, just tell me.
okay. One of the things he said during his direct testimony is that, and I don't have the exact language here, but he gave a full-throated endorsement of Dr. France's opinions, and I've asked him basically if that extends to her definition of peri-mortem in the report that you relied upon in review. And he says, I can't remember what her definition is, so I was going to say, how about you look at the report and see?
No. I'm not gonna let you do that.
Nonetheless, just to refocus here, we've already talked about what peri-mortem is. I want to follow up on that. Suppose a forensic anthropologist came into possession of a partial cranium 2 years after it had been missing or left in the wilderness, and that forensic anthropologist said that when she received the partial cranium, it was still in the peri-mortem phase. Would you trust that forensic anthropologist's opinion as to the state of that cranium?
It would depend on the environment where that cranium was found.
If it was found up in the mountains outside of Durango? Again,
That's the specific location, but it's not entirely talking about the environment. So is it covered with snow? Is it buried? Is it moist? Is it covered with flesh? You know, there's many different variables which will affect whether or not something has a peri-mortem characteristic or feature.
if Dr. France said that this partial cranium, when she got it,
Objection, Your Honor.
he's been asked about
Come on.
If, excuse me, if Dr. France said the cranium in question in this case was still in the perimortem phase when she received it in November 2015, would that affect at all your analysis of the wounds in this case, in your reference to post-mortem animal predation?
So based on my knowledge of the remains as they were recovered, I would not categorize the condition of the cranium at that stage as perimortem. I would categorize that as postmortem because there's no flesh on the bone. The bone is not, it's not encased in ice. It is, at this point in time, dry and brittle. So at the time of the recovery, I would not describe it as perimortem. I would describe the condition of the cranium at the time that the fracture was sustained and the time of the incised defects on the zygoma as perimortem. And so they could have occurred immediately before death. They could have been sustained right at the time of death, and or they might have been sustained immediately after the death, as long as that perimortem condition existed. And so if there's still flesh on the bone, if it is still moist, if it's frozen, it'll essentially be perimortem. It's preserved quite well. But once it starts to change from that, then that's when it's transitioning to clearly the post-mortem stage.
And when you first got to see the cranium, that was in 2017, correct?
That's correct.
And you understand, as you even testified on direct, perimortem is determined by the amount of elasticity and collagen in the bone that makes it bend, as you described, correct?
That's correct.
And how much the bone bends or maintains that elasticity, how much collagen it retains is going to be dependent on environmental factors, as you just discussed, right?
The condition of the collagen.
And that's what defines perimortem, is the amount of moisture, collagen in the bone, not a timeline, not an environment.
The collagen that's there is the framework upon which the calcium and the phosphorus is deposited, not the hydroxyapatite. And so they're intimately commingled. And over time, the tissue, the connective tissue portion will dry out and it will be desiccated. And likewise, any moisture that might be present in the calcium or the hydroxyapatite portion, that too. And so it becomes harder and brittle, and it is far less plastic, can't bend, it's not as elastic as bone that is wet, that has soft tissue on it.
And a perimortem fracture is one that's going to bend before it breaks, correct?
Correct.
Refocusing on the marks on the zygoma. You can't tell this jury what caused those marks. You can't say it was this tool, this instrument, this kind of knife, correct?
By class, I would say that it is a sharp force injury. It is an incised wound. I can't tell you an exact knife that did it. It's a sharp, very narrow apex that comes to a well-defined V at the base, and it has shaved a portion of the bone off, and it's left intact on one of the injuries, the more posterior, and it's chipped off on the more anterior portion.
And you've explained your analysis as to what kind of class you believe this injury is, but you can't say what instrument caused those cuts?
Sharp force injury. That's as far as I can go. So I couldn't tell you if it was a double-edged knife. I couldn't tell you if it was a kitchen knife. Couldn't tell you what kind of a knife it is.
And you couldn't say what the width of that knife was?
I would say that it is a narrow width. So let's say like an axe with a chopping mark would have a wider kerf. And a narrower, like a steak knife, would have, excuse me, I think I just made that backwards. So a thick, robust knife would have a wider kerf. A narrow, thin knife would have a pretty slender kerf. This looks slender to me.
Looks slender, but you didn't measure the width of the marks, correct?
The marks appear in photographic documentation with some measuring scale, so you could look at that.
But you didn't include any measurements in your report.
Objection asked and answered, Anna?
I don't think it was answered.
It wasn't quite answered.
You didn't include any measurements of the width of the cuts in your marks.
No, I didn't describe the length of the cut or the depth of the cut or the specific angle. That's correct.
And aside from saying perimortem blunt force trauma, you can't identify what instrument or what surface or what caused that fracture to the frontal bone, correct?
That's correct.
You got asked on direct about head injuries and blood. I want to follow up on that. And you listed several different kinds of head injuries. Subdural hematoma, what were the other ones?
So you can go from outside in. You can go to just a simple contusion. You could go to a cephalohematoma. You could go to an epidural hematoma. You could go to a subdural hematoma. If you have a cerebral cortical contusion, typically there's subarachnoid hemorrhage associated with that. And then there's intraparenchymal hemorrhage if it involves the deep structures of the brain. So you can go all the way from the most superficial all the way deep into penetrating portions of the brain.
And what are the kinds of those injuries that would produce the most blood?
It just depends on what type of skin defect is present. And so they, with the exception of just a simple contusion, which won't have any blood on the surface, any of those injuries could produce little, none, or lots. It just, I don't know what, I mean, it's basically, it's hypothetical, and I can't state without knowing what the condition of the skin surface is whether or not it will bleed or not.
Is it generally accepted in medical practice that head injuries tend to bleed a lot?
No, I mean, they do. I mean, there's lots of head injuries that do bleed a lot, but there are closed head injuries that an individual sustains. And when a person sustains a closed head injury, there may not be any defect whatsoever on the scalp or on the head.
And one of the reasons that head injuries will bleed a lot is because, as you said, on direct, the tissue on the head is very vascular, right?
If there's a defect which breaches the skin, so like a laceration or a cut, so you can have incised wounds on the skin too, and of course they would bleed.
And you testified on direct that one of the things you relied upon in your testimony was photos of where luminol was found in the house, correct?
That's correct. It was reported to me that blood was found in the home.
Did they tell you how many picograms they were talking about?
Nope, and I wouldn't ask that question.
Sounds like head injuries may bleed a lot, may not bleed a lot, depends on a lot of different factors. If there was a decapitation, I take it that would bleed a lot.
Generally speaking, a decapitation would bleed.
And I bet the same goes for dismemberment. If someone dismembers the body, disarticulates the limbs from the torso, that's going to bleed a lot.
Generally speaking, yes, that would. And if not by active bleeding, just by leaking.
Have one moment, Judge.
Yes.
And you can't say whether the fracture on the frontal bone or the cuts on the zygoma contributed to the death of Dylan Redwine, correct?
Again, I don't know why Dylan died. I can't tell you his cause of death. If Dylan was alive when he sustained the skull fracture, it may not be his cause of death, but it wouldn't be an acceptable form of treatment to fracture someone's skull if they've sustained another injury, or if they've been strangled, or if they've been stabbed, or if they've been shot, or otherwise. Likewise, if a person sustains a sharp force injury and they're still alive at the time that they sustain that sharp force injury, that is not an acceptable form of treatment for any other injury that that person might have sustained. So they would contribute to the cause of death if he was alive at the time that they were sustained, because there's bleeding. I don't know what type of brain injury, if any, there was associated with that linear skull fracture or that diastatic fracture. I just can't answer because I don't have the brain to look at. I don't have the neuro to look at. I don't have any of the internal organs to look at. So if he was alive when they were sustained, they contributed to his death. If he was deceased at that time, then I would just call them perimortem injuries.
But that's why you put undetermined, because you just don't know how Dylan died.
That's correct. I don't.
Nothing further.
Redirect?
Undetermined for what?
Undetermined for the cause of death, not the manner of death. Manner of death, in my opinion, is clearly homicide. The cause of death, I'll never know.
Just have a few follow-up questions for you.
Sure.
If you were involved in this case from the beginning, would you have asked to have an examination of the cranium, photographs taken, and a forensic anthropologist involved?
Yes, I would.
With regards to counsel's question about dismemberment, someone's dismembered, would the amount of blood that you'd expect be influenced by whether the person was alive or dead for a particular period of time?
So again, this would be contextual. So if a person is dismembered, and if obviously they're going to be deceased at that point there, but they have been dismembered, the blood would leak out during the process of dismemberment. If they're alive, it would be pumped out by the circulation. And so, yes, you would see lots of blood.
So there's a difference if someone cuts off my hand right now as opposed to I'm dead for an hour, I'm dead for 3 hours, and so on.
Right. If you're dead for a period of time and you cut a hand off, it may not have any blood come out at all. Ultimately, what happens is after a person dies, the blood will congeal. There are proteins in the blood. They're clotting proteins. And so after death, even though they may not be actively activated as you would see in an individual who's living, the blood will congeal and it will form a clot. And again, it's not the same thing as what's called an antemortem clot or a clot while a person's alive. It's a very clear distinction, but blood will basically form a loose postmortem clot after death, and that will limit the way that it flows. A person will dehydrate after death, and so because you're losing moisture, and of course you're losing the fluid content, that also too may affect how blood flows. So not to be obsessive and compulsive in terms of my answer, but if somebody's just been killed and if they just get dismembered, yeah, blood's going to leak out all over the place. If it's been a period of time sufficient for the blood to clot and dehydrated, then you could cut a limb off and it's not going to do anything. Or if it's frozen, it won't do anything.
Dr. Kurtzman, you seemed like you wanted to give a more complete answer to the information you looked at in this case, in terms of as a forensic pathologist, looking at the background information, the information provided by law enforcement needed to determine your expert opinion in a case. You want to follow up on that?
Yeah, that's the information that I would expect of any, if I was in the medical examiner's office, I would expect the investigator to provide that information for me. If I'm working with a coroner, I would expect the coroner to provide the background information to me, and that would be information that's collected by medical personnel, it would be by law enforcement personnel, it would be by any of a team of people that's necessary to investigate any death. In this particular case, I was not called in to investigate the case specifically by the coroner, and I don't know that I would have accepted at that time just because of everything that had happened. But in this case, I was contacted by the district attorney's office, and I was asked if I would render an opinion about the case. And I agreed that I would render an opinion about the case. And so I asked for the same material that I would normally have expected had I been involved at the very beginning.
And that's my question. Is this the kind of material you would look at normally in reaching your expert opinion as a forensic pathologist?
Exactly. And I would just take that information at face value because I have to form my own opinion. I cannot provide someone else's opinion that I may agree or disagree with. I have to form my own opinion.
So for members of the jury who have not been a part of this process before, not been to autopsies and so on, I'll give you a hypothetical. If the guy is found on a bike path, no bike in sight, you're not simply brought the body, he suffers a closed head wound and he's dead. You're not simply brought the body and told, determine cause and manner, just based on what you find.
I'm not sure if
Let me ask it this way.
Yeah.
In that kind of situation, gentleman found on the bike path, closed head injury, bike is gone, he's deceased.
Correct.
It's your job to determine cause and manner of death.
Correct.
So would you believe it's appropriate? Would you normally ask law enforcement to find out, in fact, was he riding a bike? According to his wife, he left the house on his bicycle. And then later, someone is found riding his bike, has his wallet on him, has his debit card on him, has his cell phone on him, has his backpack on him. Those kinds of facts, that kind of information, relevant to you in the normal course of your work?
Those are relevant, but I'm glad that you used that as an example. Just because the guy's found with the guy's bike and with his wallet and everything else doesn't mean that that guy killed the guy on the bike. All it means is that you found a guy who was dead on the ground and his bike is missing and his wallet is missing. That's something that you know unequivocally. If you happen to find the wallet on the other guy and the bike, sure, you know that unequivocally, but you don't know that that other guy killed the man, who was found on the bicycle trail. You have to put together pieces of information to tie that together. I'll give you another perfect example. It was not uncommon in the medical examiner's office in Detroit, and this has happened elsewhere, where an individual is involved in a single vehicle, motor vehicle collision. So they roll over their car. So first responders might get there and they assume, well, it's a motor vehicle collision. Maybe the individual's been ejected. And you would presume, oh, okay, well, they died of injuries sustained in a motor vehicle collision. In Detroit, it was not uncommon for us to find that individuals had been shot before they crashed. And so it's a homicide. So you can receive that information, but it's always important to do your own examination and you render an opinion based on your findings. So I don't like to work in a vacuum. I like to get that information, but I like to take it for what it's worth and render my own opinion.
That's how you go about your work normally, in terms of the information provided to you that you review.
Correct.
And then you issue and render your own expert opinion.
Correct. And as a medical examiner, I'm not working for the police agencies. I'm not working for the defenders. I'm not working for the prosecution. I am a neutral entity to provide information that could be used by whatever party needs that information.
Doctor, just switching gears for a moment, you had talked about a mark you observed in one of the photos during cross-examination, and counsel described it as inconclusive. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
How did you view that mark when you looked at it?
So I viewed that mark directly, and then I photographed it and, of course, had a chance to magnify it with the photographs. And there were some features there that suggested to me that it could possibly be a sharp force injury, but I didn't have enough objective criteria or sufficient magnification to render an interpretation that was conclusive. And so it was just better for me to say, I don't know. It's inconclusive.
And to be clear, that would be a different sharp force injury than the two that you described here today.
Correct.
Counsel asked you a number of questions about casting, and I just wanted to follow up on that briefly. Would you agree that casting and molding is frequently done in death investigations and forensic work?
Sure, it's common. And in many instances, when an individual sustains a blunt force injury and the injury affects bone, sometimes cartilage, or any other portion of the body which will retain the class and maybe individual characteristics of that particular instrument, it's not uncommon to provide casting. And that casting is a permanent record and it can be used for comparison purposes. It was common years ago, not so much today, to look at bite marks. And they used to cast bite marks. So casting is a process that's been in forensic science for years. You can cast like tire tracks, shoe prints, anything that leaves an impression onto a softer surface you can cast.
Whether it's the casting, the transport of the cranium, the different examinations, and so on, anything about that that's altered your view here?
So again, I rendered an opinion that I felt it was the casting. To be honest, I mean, it could be from handling. I don't know that for a fact. I'm assuming that most people who have handled the cranium have been careful. But again, I don't know that with 100% certainty.
And the examination you conducted and the conclusions you reached were also consistent with the photographs taken before the casting, right?
Correct.
Counsel asked you if you can tell specifically what kind of weapon or tool was used to cause the sharp force injuries to Dylan Redwine's cranium.
That's correct.
Any animal, anything in nature that you know of that could have caused those sharp force injuries, Dr. Person?
In my opinion, no.
Counsel asked you about the perimortem nature of the sharp force injuries and the blunt force trauma. Both of those, when I say both of those, I mean the blunt force trauma and the sharp force injuries. Perimortem in that they were inflicted immediately before, at the time, or immediately after Dylan Redwine's death?
Yes, with the caveat that if that perimortem condition extended out longer. So Dylan disappears in November. It's cold out. If he's covered with snow, if it's moist, it may have extended that period out.
And the perimortem fracture to the left front of Dylan's head, is that consistent with blunt force trauma or bite marks?
It's definitely not a bite mark, but a fracture, a perimortem fracture, can be the consequence of postmortem predation in some instances. I would say that it is more probable that this is a injury, a perimortem injury, as opposed to postmortem predation, but I can't state that with 100% certainty. Again, the bone, the front of the cranium, all the facial bones are missing, and in my opinion, it would not be surprising if that were a Lefort type 3 fracture, because you would have essentially dislocation of all the the facial bones from the cranium. And in fact, in most instances where I look at a skull. So somebody who finds skeletal remains, so it could be skeletal remains that have historical interest. So Native American remains that are hundreds of years old sometimes. Usually, more often than not, in my experience from a forensic standpoint, so cases that are brought to me by coroners, usually you'll find most of the cranium intact. Small portions will be up, but usually most of the cranium is there. More often than not, as opposed to one where it's as fragmented as this.
And the Lefort 3 fracture being consistent with, and the fracture we see on Dylan's cranium, blunt force trauma consistent with an object hitting the head forcefully, or the head hitting an object forcefully, or a combination of the two.
Right, it could do that. But again, it's very important for me to be very clear. I cannot exclude postmortem predation with certainty.
The sharp force injuries, anything about that seems consistent with postmortem predation to you?
No.
And as a result of all of that, is that why you concluded, in your expert opinion, that this is a homicide in some manner of death?
Correct. And also, again, the reported circumstances. Get a 13-year-old boy who's in communication with people, and then suddenly that stops. And there's a report of blood at the residence, which would suggest some type of an injury. And then the remains are ultimately discovered, and there is indication of sharp force injury, which to me is not postmortem predation. And of course, there's the fracture, which is more probable for me in my interpretation due to an injury as opposed to postmortem predation. But that part, again, I can't state with certainty.
I have no further questions for Dr. Kurtzman. Thank you, Doctor.
Any questions from the jury? Can this witness be excused?
Yes, please, Your Honor. Thank you.
By all means.
Okay, you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we'll break for the day. Again, remember your admonitions. Don't talk to the case either amongst yourselves or with anybody else. Don't initiate, post, or respond to anything about this case on social media. Keep an open mind throughout the trial. Reach a decision only during final deliberations. Do not permit any third person to discuss this case in your presence. If anyone attempts to do so, please report that to me. Don't talk with any witnesses, the defendant, or with any of the lawyers. Don't attempt to gather any information on your own. Do not engage in any outside reading. Do not visit any places mentioned in the case. Do not read about the case in the newspaper. Obtain information about it from the radio, television, internet, social media, or the media source. Do not try and learn about this case outside of the courtroom at all. So with that, thank you. It was kind of a long day, but we'll see you tomorrow. Rise for the jury.